Chapter 1, Who Priscillian Was.
I've decided to write about all the heresies present or that arose during the time of Leo with the discussion on the Manichaeans complete. It's time to focus on the errors of Priscillian, whom the Holy Pope rejected, criticized, and condemned. However, no one has accurately described or published details about the origin of this new heresy, including its founder, his homeland, character, the synods convened against him and his followers, or the various doctrines of this sect. So, as I began to write these dissertations and realized the complexity of the subject, I felt it necessary to review the works of both ancient and more recent authors on this matter. My goal was to approach this without bias, presenting only what reveals the truth or comes closest to it for the readers. When I set out to discuss Priscillian's life and corrupt ways, I believe that no scholar would disapprove of my plan, even if it seems I digress slightly from the deeds of Leo, which I intended to recount and defend throughout the dissertation. Indeed, since I encountered doubts and obscurities in this part of ecclesiastical history, along with false attributions or unknown details, my dedication to the truth compelled me to retrace and outline the whole matter from its beginnings. Priscillian was born of noble lineage and possessed great wealth. He was sharp of intellect, restless, eloquent, well-educated through extensive reading, and very skilled in discussion and debate. Truly happy, Severus Sulpicius says, if he had not corrupted his excellent talent with a misguided passion. You would certainly notice many admirable qualities in his mind and body, but he was also incredibly vain and overly impressed with his knowledge of worldly matters. So, in 211, when he brought a certain Marcus the Egyptian into his company, he absorbed all the crimes and monstrosities emerging from the Gnostic and Manichaean sects and took them into his mind. Then, adding further disgraceful acts to the doctrines of both, he introduced a new sect into the world, where promiscuous desires, debauchery, adultery, the dissolution of marriages, lies, perjuries, and other such things were practiced as if they were religious and lawful. Considering all these things myself, I was easily led to the conviction that nothing ever devised by any heretic was more harmful or disgraceful to natural honesty, more pernicious to human society, or more superstitious or sacrilegious in the destruction of religion. Besides the disgraceful acts against themselves and their neighbors, and the injuries inflicted on God, Priscillian's devotion to astrology and belief in fatal necessity were so strong that he constantly practiced magic arts. Even though he had been initiated by holy baptism and had taken the name of the Christian faith, he lived so deeply entangled in pagan errors, that he sought to honor the stars he thought favored him and to appease those that opposed him using profane and sacrilegious rites, which the Church had always avoided and abhorred from Moses' time to ours. Meanwhile, to not seem to utterly disregard all considerations of piety and religion, he pretended to show humility with excessive skill and deception, which he mastered well. He practiced walking barefoot and even advocated fasting on Sundays and the Lord's Nativity. While he affected a false gravity of manners, he especially charmed the minds of women, whose company he always sought. They were easily drawn in by these excessive arts of flattery. Gathering around him in crowds, they were quickly captivated by a desire for novelty and the freedom to indulge. What we've discussed so far about the character, practices, and behavior of Priscillian hasn't been questioned by anyone. So, there was no need for us to engage in debate or dwell on these topics for long.
Chapter 2.
There are various opinions from writers about when and where the Priscillian heresy began to spread. The serious problem of Priscillianism is said to have started spreading in the year 379, mainly in Spain. Prosper, in his chronicle, notes that during the consulship of Ausonius and Olybrius, he wrote, Gratian, after the death of his uncle, took Theodosius, son of Theodosius, as a partner, and gave him the rule of the East. At this time, Bishop Priscillian from Gaul established the heresy named after him, drawing from the teachings of the Manichaeans and Gnostics. The consulship of Ausonius, Hermogenes, and Olybrius is clearly recorded in the Roman consular records as referring to the year 379. However, it's noted that many skilled critics believe this heresy spread through Spain at a later date. This view is supported by William Cave, Severinus Binius, and others, who argue that the heresy arose 2 years later and that Priscillian originated from Spain. They claim both assertions are supported by Sulpicius Severus. However, his writings do not actually confirm either. Severus, while describing the evils of his time that unusually polluted the churches and caused disturbances, identifies the main authors but does not precisely define the timing or assert that Priscillian originated in Spain. If we closely examine Sulpicius' words, it seems the sect was hidden for a long time before Priscillian joined. It was Marcus the Egyptian, born in Memphis, with the support of a noble and wealthy woman named Agape and the rhetorician Elpidius, who first introduced the Gnostic sect into Spain, which Priscillian later joined, giving the heresy its name. He mentions that this infamous and deadly superstition of the Gnostic heresy was first discovered in Spain, hidden in secret mysteries. The origin of this evil came from the Egyptians, but it's difficult to discuss its beginnings there. Marcus was the first to introduce it into Spain, having set out from Egypt and being born in Memphis. Among his listeners were Agape, a woman of notable status, and a rhetorician named Elpidius. Priscillian, who came from a noble and wealthy family, learned from them. Severus Sulpicius highlights two periods, one where the Gnostic sect was rampant, and another where Priscillian, aligning with the Gnostics, surpassed and expanded their impiety. He turned the errors of Marcus, Agape, and Elpidius into the monstrosity of a new and abominable sect with wickedness, boldness, and raging lust. This happened during the consulship of Ausonius and Olybrius, and it couldn't have occurred later, as can be determined from other events and from the Synod of Saragossa itself. According to Sulpicius, when Priscillian realized that his followers were growing in number, he began gathering them in the secluded hideouts and retreats of the mountains for his wicked meetings. To keep these gatherings hidden, he allowed his followers to pretend to have communion with the Catholic Church by taking the sacred elements and carrying them away. So, when the bishops of Spain saw that religion, justice, and decency were being destroyed, and that there was no limit to luxury, sacrilege, and magical incantations, they carefully established laws and canons they deemed necessary to curb these serious evils. Therefore, it is unlikely, as Cavius and others have claimed, that this heresy emerged in the year of our Lord 381. How could this be, when by that time, it had already spread widely throughout those provinces and taken deep root in the minds of the wicked? When a great number of men and women would hold their gatherings in the mountains and villages as Priscillianists on certain days of the year? When finally, all the obscene and profane practices conducted in secret had become known to the pastors of the Sacred Catholic Church? The 8 canons of the Synod of Saragossa, which we will discuss shortly, reveal that all this had become known. Let's not assume that church leaders immediately convened a council as soon as this heresy was discovered. When Hyginus, the bishop of Corduba and successor of the great Hosius, first uncovered the harmful spread of Priscillian's teachings which had even swayed some bishops like Instantius and Salvianus, he wanted to report the issue to Odesius, the priest of the city of Emerita. Hyginus grew quite agitated with the sectarians, and as Severus Sulpicius notes, he went after Instantius and his followers more aggressively than was appropriate, fueling the fire instead of putting it out. So, even though the issue was brought to Odesius and Instantius and his followers faced intense harassment, a council was not convened right away. It was only after many struggles between both sides, when the Catholics' hopes of leading the heretics to repentance were dashed, that 12 Catholic bishops finally gathered in Caesar Augusta. Therefore, with this earlier mistake highlighted by Cavius, Severinus Spinius, and others in 213, it was necessary to prevent and address the latter issue, particularly concerning the homeland and origin of Priscillian. However, to avoid giving the impression that I'm disparaging any particular nation, I'll barely touch on that topic. I'll simply say that attributing this claim to Severus Sulpicius that Priscillian was born in Spain is entirely incorrect, as nothing in Severus's second book of history supports this. Indeed, if we examine the testimonies of other ancient sources, we'll find it challenging to definitively resolve this matter. Even Jerome, who often reported on the origins of others, while frequently discussing Priscillian's character, actions, and demise, consistently remained silent about his homeland and origin. Priscillian spread his errors among gatherings of men and women throughout Spain. He reportedly took a woman named Galla, not by nationality but by name, as an accomplice in his wicked deeds. However, he either remained silent or concealed his own origins. It's well known that none of the recent opinions of Cavius and others are supported by any ancient fathers who wrote about this heresy. In various writings, Augustine describes the errors of the Priscillianists, which he notes Priscillian established in Spain. Orosius, who lived around the same time as Priscillian, lamented in a note or consultation to Augustine that this heresy had spread only through Spain. Idatius mentions Priscillian and the Priscillianists in his chronicle but never indicated that he originated from Spain. Similarly, Epiphanius, in his 49th heresy, briefly outlines Priscillian's crimes and wicked deeds but says nothing about his origin or homeland. Finally, the author of the book on heresies, attributed to Rufinus of Palestine in the 27th volume of the Library of the Fathers, only states that Priscillian is said to have started the 70th heresy of the Priscillianists among the Spaniards. When I considered all these things, it was not to defend the rights of the Spanish people or to clear them of this mark, but rather to adhere to the truth and prevent the suspicion that some might think Priscillian originated in Gaul. The most serious and solid foundations of this suspicion were not only bolstered by the praised chronicle of Prosper of Aquitaine but also by many other conjectures. For that chronicle, which bears the name of Prosper of Aquitania, or the one expanded by Tyro and published by Canisius, explicitly states, Priscillian, bishop from Galatia, Priscillian, bishop from Gaul. They clearly indicate that the province of Aquitaine was affected by this heresy. Among others, Eucrotia, the wife of Delphidius or Helpidius the rhetorician, was linked with Priscillian in both crimes and death. This Delphidius, or Helpidius, was a Gallic man teaching rhetoric in the same province of Aquitaine, as shown by the oldest records of Christian Gaul. When discussing the Archbishopric of Bordeaux, they wrote about Saint Delphinus around the year 380. Saint Delphinus, a unique ornament of the Gallican Church, at the council held in Saragossa, Spain, in Tarraconensis, in the year 380 or the following year, he attended with other bishops of Aquitaine, where Priscillian, Delphidius, the Aquitanian rhetorician, and other followers of wicked doctrines were condemned. Furthermore, how can we dismiss such a clear and evident testimony from Prosper? Neither Tilemon nor Dionysius Petavius rejected it or noted any errors. Although they avoided discussing Priscillian's homeland and origin, they traced the beginning of his heresy to the year 379, based solely on Prosper testimony. Therefore, Prosper himself would not have called Priscillian a Gaul, to the disgrace and shame of himself and the entire people of Aquitaine, if it had not been thoroughly evident to him and others. Arguing against the most common tradition and belief of everyone would seem like looking for a knot in a bulrush. Indeed, it is confidently affirmed that Priscillian originated where his errors were first spread. However, if the praised chronicle uses the term Galatia, it shouldn't be assumed that Priscillian was a Gaul because of this. This is especially true since scholars have often judged that chronicle to be full of errors. In other contexts, the ancients sometimes used the term to refer to the Galatian people within the borders of Spain, which we could demonstrate with hundreds of examples. We'll specifically illustrate this when we discuss the letter from St. Leo the Great to Turribius of Astorga. We'll delve into this more clearly when we narrate the history in its proper context.
Chapter 3.
Instantius and Salvianus, bishops from Spain who supported Priscillian, ordained him as bishop of Avila. Around this time, he was initially condemned at the council in Saragossa and then expelled from Spain by an edict from Emperor Gratian, prompting him to travel to Rome to meet Damasus. 1. Setting aside inaccurate claims from some critics that might mislead the reader, we need to focus on Odysseus and the other 11 bishops from Gaul and Spain. Despite numerous efforts, they were never able to curb Priscillian's boldness, unrestrained behavior, or sacrilegious superstition. Through the authority of the Holy Church and their unanimous agreement, the Fathers made decisions to better safeguard religion, divine worship, the mysteries of faith, piety, moral integrity, and human society, aiming to eradicate that harmful influence. The bishops who gathered in Saragossa were Phaetadius, Delphinus, Eutychianus, or Bastitinus, Ampelius, Orgentius, Lucius, Ithachius, Splendonius, Valerius, the bishop of Saragossa, Symposius, Cathrius, and Idesius. Acting like a sacred senate, they created 8 canons or laws, which Bishop Lucius recited at the assembly, so that all the bishops would declare a curse against transgressors. Examples of these decisions or laws are documented in the 2nd volume of the Councils, with Severinus Binius providing various notes on them. 2. Meanwhile, during these events at the council in Saragossa, neither Instantius nor Salvianus, nor Priscillian or any of his followers attended the gathering. They all avoided appearing before these fathers to escape judgment. Severus Sulpicius recounts the event, noting a decision was made against those absent and those who dared to receive the condemned into communion. Consequently, after numerous significant struggles between them, a council was convened in Saragossa, which also included bishops from Aquitaine. However, the heretics, unwilling to submit themselves to the council's judgment in 215, were condemned in absentia. This sentence included bishops Instantius and Salvianus, as well as laymen Helpidius and Priscillian. It was also decreed that anyone who accepted these condemned individuals into communion would face the same punishment. When the sectarians discovered this, it fueled even greater hostility against the Church and all Catholics. To spread unrest and further their wicked errors, the 2 bishops condemned by the Council of Saragossa, Instantius, and Salvianus, appointed Priscillian a layman marked by the same synod as the leader of all evils as a bishop in the town of Labia, according to Severus. They believed that arming a sharp and cunning man with priestly authority would ensure their safety. The impiety of this grave crime, which polluted the honor and authority of the priesthood with utmost disgrace, was noted and abhorred by figures like Jerome at Ctesiphon. He described the origin and significant growth of that heresy in Spain. Agape led Elpidius, a woman leading a man, blind leading the blind into a pit, and had Priscillian, the most devoted follower of Zoroaster the magician, as her successor, transforming a magician into a bishop. Galla, not related by blood but by name, made her sister, who wandered aimlessly, the heir of another neighboring heresy. The Council of Saragossa in the year 381, convened under Pope Damasus, clearly illustrates this in the canons published by Garcia Loisa. However, the complete acts of the same council either perished or have not yet come to light, as Severus Sulpicius tells us. Indeed, as we have seen, in that sacred assembly, anathema was pronounced upon those who rashly accepted the already condemned into communion, a sentence especially intended for Aedesius, the bishop of Córdoba. Even though he initially wanted to eliminate that sect and had declared war on Priscillian and his followers, and had even persuaded Aedesius through letters, he later changed his mind and did not approve of the Catholics' plans. Instead, he shamefully distanced himself from the council and accepted the wicked heretics into communion. The task was given to Bishop Ithacius of Sasabium to make the bishop's decree known to everyone, particularly to exclude Hyginus from communion. Hyginus, after being the first to openly attack the heretics, later shamefully accepted them into communion. From the series of events and their narration, we clearly understand that the praised 8 canons that remain are indeed sincere and genuine. Among the bishops who signed them, the names of Hyginus or Aedesius of Córdoba are not found at all. They also criticize certain prominent errors of that sect, openly forbidding and attacking their rituals, teachings, gatherings, and fasts. Although many other crimes and immoralities, perhaps not yet thoroughly investigated at that time, are omitted in silence. Truly, the state of those churches became more miserable by the day. For those 2 Catholic bishops, especially Aedesius and Ithacius, pursued more aggressively and approached the judges of the world after synodal decrees and after the disgraceful ordination of Priscillian, so that by their decrees and executions, heretics would be expelled from the cities. Therefore, at the urging of the same Sulpicius, after many shameful events, a rescript was obtained by Aedesius' petition from Emperor Gratian in 216, by which all heretics were ordered to be banished not only from the churches or cities but from all lands. Severus Sulpicius and other more gentle-minded Catholic bishops judged the conduct of Aedesius and Ithacius to be too harsh and disgraceful. Without consulting any other bishops from Spain and Gaul, nor informing Damasus himself, the Roman pontiff, the matter of the sectarians was brought before the tribunal of the world. This wasn't about lay people, but rather bishops Instantius, Salvianus, and Priscillian, who were indeed tainted with heretical corruption. The inquiry wasn't about crimes that the emperor would investigate, but those that required ecclesiastical judgment. Furthermore, it's noted that Aedesius and Ithacius approached Gratian with only their private authority, not with the council's sanction, seeking his judgment. Therefore, it was rightly considered a disgrace to the church and a great dishonor to the sacred order. Meanwhile, Priscillian and the others, who seemed to be bishops, realized they were sentenced to exile. They lost confidence in their situation and, not daring to contest the judgment, willingly withdrew. The multitude of laypeople, however, was scattered by fear, but even in these adverse circumstances, they did not despair of finding help and support. Thus, those 3 bishops, leaders of the other sectarians, decided to travel to Rome, suffering the penalties of their crimes by a decree of public authority. By deceiving Damasus, the Roman pontiff, they obtained a deceitful ecclesiastical reconciliation and were regarded as innocent and harmless by the Catholics. As they journeyed to Rome, they traveled from Spain through the province of Aquitaine. They were welcomed grandly by the unlearned and spread seeds of treachery, particularly corrupting the people of Alusa, who were then good and devoted to religion, with their false teachings. The city of Alusa, by the little river Gelais, was very ancient, once the seat of archbishops or metropolitans of Novem Populonia, under which the city of Och, along with many others, was included. From Alusa, the region called Ilusanus, now part of the Armagnac county, derived its name. It's said to have turned into a small town due to frequent devastations inflicted by the Goths, Saracens, and Normans. We have noted this from Dionysius Samarthanus, in Volume 1 of Gallia Christiana, who further testified to having recently seen a new catalogue of the bishops of Alusa. Priscillian and his followers then moved to the Diocese of Bordeaux. However, they were turned away by Bishop Delphinus. After staying briefly on the property of Eucrotia, a notorious and shameless woman, they managed to spread their beliefs to some people. They then continued their journey with a scandalous entourage, including wives and other women, among whom were Eucrotia and her daughter Procla. There were rumors that Procla, seduced by Priscillian, had used herbs to end her pregnancy. Whether Procla conceived a child with Priscillian and then terminated it, or whether Priscillian had inappropriate relations with both mother and daughter, Severus dared not conclude, relying only on the opinions of some people. After numerous new and terrible crimes, it's evident from both public rumor and reliable records that Priscillian and his companions came to Rome. This situation even provides a new example for church discipline, showing that those condemned in councils often appealed and turned to the judgments of the Roman pontiffs. These pontiffs, with the apostolic authority of the divine Peter, could either annul or confirm the actions of other bishops, even those decided in synods. Although we might consider this example, taken from enemies of faith, as insignificant and not adhere to it, we argue that it shouldn't be entirely dismissed. The Spanish bishops did not belong to the Roman Council, contrary to what Quesnelus imagines, that only they could be judged by pontiffs. Neither Priscillian nor his associates were listed among the Roman clergy, nor did they wish to flatter the Roman seat, as Launius cleverly contends. Instead, they intended to use the rite indicated by the sacred scriptures, which the universal tradition of the Fathers proclaims, and which the general practice of the churches everywhere had obtained. Regarding Priscillian and his companions, after the synodal decrees and the decision of Emperor Gratian, they chose not to appeal to a general council. Faced with the recent words and desires of the heretics, they found themselves confined to the authority of the Roman See within narrower limits. It's well known that Priscillian tried to gain support and protection from Damasus, the Roman pontiff. According to Sulpicius, when they arrived in Rome to clear themselves before Damasus, they weren't even allowed to meet him. The Holy Pontiff, guided by the Spirit always present in the successors of Peter, made their unjust attempts unsuccessful by denying them any chance for vindication. Their arrival in the city to plead their case strongly suggests that the cases of bishops and others, already decided by synodal decrees, could be reviewed and judged again by the authority of the Roman pontiffs. However, this is only briefly mentioned, so that we don't overlook the reasoning of modern theologians. With their initial attempts thwarted, Priscillian and Instantius turned their attention to new efforts, which will soon become clear.
Chapter 4.
Emperor Gratian, influenced by Macedonius, orders that Instantius and Priscillian be reinstated. On Brito, the bishop of Trier, and the honor and privileges of that see, the false assumptions of Blondel and Tillemon are dismissed. Despite the severe rejection from Pope Damasus, Instantius, and Priscillian, the bishops did not see their situation as hopeless. Instead, driven by the typical stubbornness of heretics, they sought a way to resolve their troubles in exile. They came up with a new plan, to return to Milan, perhaps hoping that Ambrose, the esteemed bishop of that church, would accept them into the communion of the Catholics. This persuasion, however, only influenced Instantius and Priscillian, as there were no other bishops left who were accomplices in their crimes and heresy, since Salvianus had already died in Rome. But things did not go as they had hoped. When Ambrose learned of the actions of the Roman pontiff, he too began to oppose them, considering it a serious crime to even hear them or admit them into communion, as the apostolic see of St. Peter had rejected them. Then, as Sulpicius reports, Priscillian and Instantius changed their plans when they failed to deceive the two bishops of great authority at that time. So they sought to achieve their desires from the emperor through bribery and flattery. At that time, Gratian still held supreme control of the empire, and since Macedonius, the master of offices, exerted influence more through his cunning than through authority, he easily persuaded Gratian to revoke and abolish the previous decree of exile against Priscillian and his associates. He issued an edict restoring them to the positions from which they had been expelled. This was indeed regarded by all as a grave and monstrous crime. Indeed, Gratian, who was otherwise a religious man and a very pious ruler, was misled by a corrupt master of offices. He made the reckless decision not only to annul and erase the previous decrees he had so sacredly issued, but also to oppose the Synod of Saragossa, the great Ambrose, the Roman Pope, and even himself, which was more serious. Instantius and Priscillian, pleased with Emperor Gratian's leniency towards them, quickly returned to Spain. At the start of the year 383, they went and took their episcopal seats. Aidatius, though willing to resist, couldn't protect the faith. He lacked the means because the heretics, having bribed the proconsul Volventius, had strengthened their position. Seeing themselves supported by such great worldly power, they boldly attacked the Catholic bishop Ithacius, accusing him before the proconsul of disturbing the churches. The proconsul, siding with these wicked people, violated all divine and human law and ordered Ithacius's severe execution. But Ithacius courageously fled to Gaul, where he sought out the prefect Gregory. When Gregory, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard of Gaul, fully understood the situation, he immediately summoned the troublemakers and informed the emperor, urging him to block the path of ambition for the heretics. However, this was in vain, as Severus notes, because everything there was for sale due to the greed and power of a few. Thus, the heretics, using their cunning and bribing Macedonius with a large sum of money, succeeded in having the prefect's authority removed by imperial decree. The jurisdiction was handed over to the vicar of Spain, Marianus, since they no longer had a proconsul. When Macedonius sent military officers to Trier to forcibly remove Ithacius and bring him back to Spain to face the heretics' terrible frenzy, the bishop of Trier stood his ground. Discovering the deceit, he cleverly thwarted the disgraceful attempts of Macedonius, the master of imperial offices, and these military officers with remarkable wisdom and steadfastness. Among the defenders of the Catholic faith, it's clear from what's been said that the bishop of the Britons in Trier held a significant position. When Severus Sulpicius mentioned him, he referred to him as Praetonus. However, there's a concern he might have had two names or that an error crept into Severus's copies due to a similarity in names. In the records of that church, this name is missing. But we find another similar name, Brito or Britannius, who in the year 374 signed the Council of Valentinus. I, Brito the bishop, wish you, brothers, to fare well in the Lord. Besides the chronicles of that city, Bollandus on May 5 mentions Britannius among the confessors of that church. Sermondus supports this in his notes on the Council of Valentinus, and almost all writers, including Blondellus and Tillemontius, agree on this. We must not overlook what these last two authors wrote about Bishop Brito, as they might claim for him a special honor and jurisdiction among Western bishops after Pope Damasus. They suggest that Trier, being the seat of some emperors, had attained such honor and power that even its bishop excelled others, whether in synods or public acts. They claim that the city of Trier was the most important, not just in Gaul, but also in Spain and England, because either the emperor's prefect or even the emperors themselves would stay there when they were in Gaul. Influenced by this, the Eastern Fathers, in a letter written to the Roman Council in the year 382 AD by Theodoret, placed the bishop of Trier right after Damasus and Ambrose, and before the bishops of Aquileia, Thessalonica, and Sirmium, to highlight his virtue and authority. It's truly a delightful and fanciful tale, but it's surprising that, due to this imperial seat, they didn't claim precedence for the bishop of Trier over Damasus and Ambrose. Yet, everyone can see how weak that reasoning is. Indeed, the honor and prerogatives of episcopal seats don't come from civil administration of temporal matters, worldly power, emperors' prefects, or seats, or even from the consuls of the provinces themselves, all of which have changed countless times, as both sacred and secular monuments show. Rather, they must be traced back to their origin, antiquity, and founders. Regarding the privileges granted by councils and the gifts and dispensations of the Roman pontiffs, where metropolitan authority was given to certain churches, it cannot be shown that this was granted to the seat of Trier over other churches in Gaul, Spain, and England during Brito's time. On the contrary, if we trust ecclesiastical records, it's clear that the bishop of Trier did not have primacy over the archbishop of Vienne, as well as those of Narbonne, Lyon, and several other bishops of Gaul, who gathered at the Valence Synod. Brito, along with Blondel and Tillemont, ranked 15th in signing the acts of that synod. Let's talk about the two writers who are striving to establish a new kind of patriarch in the West over the provinces of three kingdoms as the 4th century was coming to a close. Who should we trust more? Is it the Briton himself, described with such great privileges due to his position, or the conjectures some might use to elevate the rights of the Roman See? No sensible person would imagine a bishop of such honor and authority sitting 15th when that council was held in Gaul, in the city of the Allobroges, under the Archbishopric of Vienne. Moreover, the Briton himself signed those acts after Justus, the Bishop of Vienne. Regarding the Eastern letter praised by Theodoret, what do they say when they find the name of Briton right after Damasus and Ambrose? I ask, is he the Bishop of Trier? Theodoret never confirms this. In fact, Henri Valois suspected him to be the Bishop of Capua, but we think it's impossible to decide, as the acts of that Roman synod convened by Damasus are no longer fully preserved in the collection of councils, and the bishop's subscriptions have long been lost. But let's assume this Briton was indeed the Bishop of Trier. Is it such a strong argument from that Eastern bishop's letter that this poorly constructed or copied heading alone should resolve such an important question? Did Theodoret report it as he found it in his autograph? Or were those Eastern fathers well informed about the order of Western sees or faithfully following it without alteration? Who can confirm either? Firstly, those Easterners who gathered in council in Constantinople refused to attend the Roman Synod of Damasus, which was happening at the time. They made excuses, saying that after enduring so many serious hardships from the fury of the Arians, they could not undertake such a long and arduous journey to Rome. Because of this, they sent 3 bishops as delegates to Damasus and the Roman Synod, Cyriacus, Eusebius, and Priscillian. They brought with them a highly regarded letter from Theodoret. For the Fathers of the East, Both the order maintained by the Western bishops in the Roman Council and the number of these bishops were completely unknown. So, they listed only a few names and concluded with a general statement. And to the other holy bishops gathered in the celebrated city of Rome. I won't address the suspected faith of Theodoret when reviewing ancient records, as Baronius and others have rightly accused him of similar deceptions. However, sermon studies suggest that such fraud is absent from the Acts of the Council of Valentia. The learned man ensured that the manuscripts from Reims, Lyon, Anethia, Fossat, and 3 others from the Jesuit College of Paris, included in the collection of Isidore, were more accurately brought to light. He believed these manuscripts were written over 900 years ago. Therefore, the complete agreement of these original texts removes any suspicion of fraud, as knowledgeable people will agree with us. Now, let's return to Priscillian and Ithacaius. When Macedonius and his officials' efforts were blocked by Prytaneus, or the British bishop, preventing Ithacaius from being taken back from the city of Trier to Spain, a serious rumor began to spread that Clement Maximus had taken power in Britannia and would soon invade Gaul. Thus, Ithacaius decided to wait for the arrival of the new emperor, despite the uncertain circumstances, while taking no action. Indeed, events unfolded as the rumor predicted. In the year of our Lord 383, Maximus, the commander of the imperial forces in Britain, seized power, was proclaimed emperor by his soldiers, and sent an army into Gaul, strengthening his rule against the legions opposed to Gratian. Baronius mentions this in Volume 4, for the year of Christ 383, from Victor and Zosimus.
Chapter 5.
On the tyrant Maximus and his judgment against the Priscillianists. While Gratian was still emperor and Macedonius managed the empire's affairs, the Catholic bishops, particularly Ithacaius, had little hope that the impiety and boldness of the Priscillianists would be overturned. However, when the legions of Gaul, opposed to Gratian, declared Maximus, the leader of the imperial forces, as emperor in Britain and other regions, the situation with the Priscillianists deteriorated significantly. The nature of Maximus's character was briefly described by Gildas, also known as the Wise, who said, Maximus, using cunning more than virtue, drew neighboring territories and provinces into his treacherous and deceitful kingdom against the Roman state, extending one wing to Spain and the other to Italy, and set up the throne of his most unjust empire at Trier. He raged against his masters with such madness that he expelled 2 legitimate emperors, one from Rome and the other from a most religious life. Thus, Maximus went to Trier, and having established his imperial seat there, Ithacaius did not hesitate to inform the new emperor of everything the Priscillianists, the Catholic fathers, and Gratian had done up to that point. Gratian was no longer alive. He had been abandoned by his own people, possibly due to his excessive leniency towards the Priscillianists, and was killed by the deceit of the leader Andragotheus near Lugdunum on August 25, 383. Meanwhile, Maximus, not wanting to appear hostile to the church's affairs or allow them to become more troubled, entrusted the judgment of the heretics to the ecclesiastical pastors gathered in Bertigala, also known as Bordeaux. For this reason, our Severus Sulpicius says, he sent letters to the prefect of Gaul and the deputy of Spain, ordering that all those ensnared by that corruption be brought to the synod in Bordeaux. When they convened at the synod, Instantius was the first to present himself before the judges. Ordered to defend himself, he could not clear himself of the charges. They notice him and declare that he is unworthy of being a bishop. Realizing this and aware of his weaker position, Priscillian immediately appeals to Emperor Maximus to avoid the judgment of the Sacred Assembly. Severus describes the story almost in these words and criticizes the council fathers for their weak approach, saying, Priscillian, fearing the bishops, appealed to the emperor. This was allowed due to the inconsistency of our people, as they should have either imposed a sentence on the dissenters, or, if they themselves were considered suspect, reserved the hearing for other bishops, not let such obvious crimes be judged by the emperor. Thus, all those involved in the case were brought before the king. However, to avoid appearing to act behind the scenes, we completely refrain from discussing the violated rights of the Church here. It's enough for us to note the testimony of Severus Sulpicius, from which only the foolish or blind could deny that the Church has shuddered at such appeals as sacrilegious from its very beginnings, which Maimbergus, a century later, audaciously and recklessly defended as permissible due to abuse. Therefore, Maximus, who had tyrannically overturned all the rights of the empire by any means, disregarding and despising both the methods of Aurelian and Constantine the Great, did not shy away from this role of judgment either, but claimed it for himself immediately. The most holy bishops, including Martin of Tours, considered this a very serious crime and earnestly begged the emperor not to punish the heretics with death but to be content with the judgment of the priests and order them to be expelled from their episcopal seats. At first, Maximus seemed inclined to this judgment. Indeed, Severus Sulpicius asserts that he had already been persuaded by the urging of Martin of Tours. However, while Ithacius was fervently acting as prosecutor and pushing the emperor for the death of the accused due to his intense hatred, the assembly of Catholic bishops split into two groups, each unwilling to associate with the other. The first group argued wisely and devoutly that they should not spill the blood of the unfortunate. Meanwhile, the other, more brutal and ruthless, insisted that the crimes deserved the death penalty. With the situation in limbo, the secular court delayed the case until St. Martin stayed in Trier. Maximus welcomed him warmly and respectfully, promising Martin as he was about to leave Trier that no bloody verdict would be made against the accused. However, the outcome soon mocked this promise. The emperor, swayed by Magnus and Rufus, bishops of Spain, and distracted from more lenient advice, assigned the case to Evodius, a strict and stern man. After a double trial where Priscillian was found guilty of wrongdoing, and with Priscillian not denying his involvement in obscene teachings, holding nighttime meetings with immoral women, and praying naked, Evodius declared him guilty and kept him in custody until he could report to the emperor. As for the bishops who influenced Maximus, since they are not mentioned by the ancients, we cannot provide the names of their seats. We only read in the life of St. Martin about a Bishop Rufus, who was deceived by a young man pretending to be Elijah and Christ, leading him to worship the man as the Lord. Consequently, he was later removed from the bishopric. Regarding the judgment against the Priscillianists initiated by Evodius, there is no need to fear that the bloody outcome contradicted the emperor's promise to Martin. After the investigation from the previous chapter was completed, the accused had confessed, and the criminals were held in prison. It was time to summon the accusers before the accused according to the highest legal standards. With the inquiry strengthened and concluded, the emperor could finally pass judgment. Then Ithacius, as noted by Severus Sulpicius, realized that appearing as an accuser, especially at the final trials of capital crimes, would be unpopular among the bishops, so he withdrew from the proceedings. His cunning crime was now complete. Only because of the hostility he aroused among the Catholic bishops did Ithacius begin to regret the crime he committed. However, he could not escape the accusation of crimes. Maximus ordered a certain Patricius, a protector of Ithacius's treasury, to assume the role and duties of accuser. This way, with him pressing the case, Priscillian, along with Felicissimus and Arminius, who had recently defected to the heretic side, would be condemned to death. Latronianus, Eucrotia, Asarinius, and Aurelius the deacon were also executed by the sword. However, Instantius was treated more leniently. He was exiled to the island of Silana beyond Britain, where he was accompanied by Tiberianus, who had been stripped of all his possessions by a judge's decree. Finally, others such as Tertullus, Potamius, and Johannes, considered lesser individuals and worthy of mercy because they had betrayed themselves and their companions before the inquiry, were relegated to temporary exile within Gaul. The same massacre is said to have occurred in the year of our Lord 385, according to Prosper in his chronicle, during the consulship of Arcadius and Botto. At that time, Siricius, with Damasus having already passed away the previous year, had taken the helm of the Catholic Church. Prosper also adds that the following year, during the consulship of Honorius and Evodius, a disciple of Priscillian named Urbica was killed by stones in a public riot in Bordeaux due to her stubborn impiety. However, in another chronicle circulated under the name of Tyro, it is narrated that the public riot against Urbica occurred during the consulship of Arcadius and Botto. With so many people either killed or exiled, the state of religion and the church seemed to be in decline. Initially, the heresy started by Priscillian not only wasn't suppressed, but it actually grew stronger and spread more widely. His followers, who had once honored him as a saint, began to venerate him as a martyr. The bodies of the deceased were brought to Spain, where their funerals were held with great ceremony. It even became a profound religious act to swear by Priscillian. However, religion wasn't just undermined in Spain by this sacrilegious and wicked worship, but also in Gaul, where a significant schism occurred, splitting the Catholic bishops into two factions. Some criticized Ithacius not only because he pursued those accused of betraying the faith in a capital case, against the Church's tradition and gentleness, but also because, after being publicly condemned by Bishop Theognostus, they refrained from his communion. Others, fearing the king, supported Ithacius and did not avoid his communion.
Chapter 6.
Maximus the tyrant gave the Roman Pope a written confession of the Catholic faith. The emperor incited new disasters against the Priscillianists throughout Spain. It's long been recognized by scholars that emperors and world leaders, as defenders of sacred laws and the Catholic religion, should support and protect the Church in its times of need. This helps ensure that a tyrant or the madness of heretics doesn't destroy the divine mysteries. So, it's not surprising that when the Roman popes first heard of someone being declared emperor, they demanded a confession of the Catholic faith from them, refusing communion without it. Pope St. Siricius offers one of the earliest examples of this practice. After being elevated to the papacy in the year 185 following the death of Damasus, he requested this confession from Maximus, who willingly complied in his letter, as was customary for fair and Christian rulers. In the letter, Maximus first acknowledges the papal correspondence, then praises the priestly duty's greatness and the dignity of the magnificent city of Rome, stating, "Regarding the Catholic faith, about which you wished for my counsel, the greater and special judgment of divinity that surrounds me, the more I confess to having greater care, as I have ascended to the empire directly from the saving font itself, and God has always supported me in all my endeavors and successes, and today, and, as I hope, forever deigns to be my protector and guardian, most beloved Father." He also promises to ensure that the priests of the Church handle ecclesiastical matters, especially those concerning Agritius, whom the Holy Pontiff noted had improperly ascended to the rank of priesthood. Therefore, Maximus, wanting to follow the example of lawful emperors, says, "What can I do more respectfully for our Catholic faith than to let Catholic priests judge this matter, about which they are knowledgeable? To allow the bishops of Gaul and others within 5 provinces to attend conveniently, he decides that a meeting should be held in a city of their choice, where they can reside and deliberate on what custom holds and what the law is." Finally, intending to provide a distinguished testimony of his sincere faith, he tells the pontiff how, upon arriving from Britain to Trier, he discovered that the religion of many wrongdoers was so tainted and polluted with corruption that, unless, he says, our provision and remedy, which came from the fear of the highest God, had quickly brought help, a great division and destruction would have arisen, and the later growth of vices would have been barely curable. Regarding the superstition and impiety of the Priscillianists, whom Maximus refers to as Manichaeans, what they admitted was not based on arguments or uncertain suspicions but on their own confessions during trials. "I prefer that your holiness learns from the acts themselves rather than from my account, because such matters are not only shameful to do but also disgraceful to speak of, and we cannot discuss them without embarrassment." It is clear that Maximus the tyrant sent the acts of the entire investigation and inquiry to Siricius with this letter. However, what he replied to these matters or what judgment the Holy Pontiff made from those acts cannot be extracted from any existing records of Christian affairs. We only understand one thing for certain against some recent dogmatists, namely, that Roman pontiffs exercised at least indirect power over Catholic kings. Pope Siricius wouldn't have inquired about Emperor Maximus's faith, nor would he have asked for a written profession from him, if he didn't have the authority from the highest office of the priesthood to judge whether Maximus ruled justly or unjustly, or as a tyrant, but let's leave that topic for others to discuss. Meanwhile, we've noted that in the same year, the bishops of the Ithacian faction gathered at a council in Trier, where other bishops of sounder judgment also attended. They appealed to Maximus to overturn the sentence of excommunication and deposition that Bishop Theognostus had pronounced against Ithacius, seeking to absolve him as an innocent man, so no one could deny him communion. Martin was compelled to attend the synod by authority. Surrounded by magistrate officials, he first promised that he came to Trier with the peace of Christ. Then, upon entering the imperial palace and intimidated by Maximus's threats, he was forced to communicate with the heretics supporting Ithacius for just an hour, even though he wished to stand by the ordination of Bishop Felix of Trier. However, he couldn't be persuaded by any threats to confirm that communion in writing. The next day, as Severus describes in the dialogues, when Martin was leaving, he groaned in sorrow over having been involved in the harmful communion, even for an hour. He reflected on his grief, internally debating his actions, when suddenly an angel appeared to him and said, "Rightly, Martin, you are troubled, but you could not have left otherwise. Restore your virtue, regain your constancy, so you do not risk not your glory, but your salvation." From that time on, he was careful not to associate with the communion of the Ithacian faction. However, he realized that due to that harmful communion, he received divine help and assistance for performing miracles later than usual, especially when he wished to heal those possessed by demons. He lived for another 16 years, never attending a synod, and withdrew from all assemblies of bishops. Thus, Severus Sulpicius concludes that chapter in the Praise Dialogue 3. Before discussing the year of his death, we must address the disaster that Emperor Maximus, following the Council of Trier's decision, inflicted upon the heretics spreading across Spain. He chose to send tribunes with full military power to hunt down those marked by heretical corruption, seizing their lives and property if caught. However, this decree starkly contrasted with the Church's gentle nature, as it was filled with anger and hatred. It deeply troubled Martin, who felt profound internal anguish. He knew, without hesitation, that due to the tribune's greed and lust, not only would the wicked and sacrilegious be targeted, but Catholics and even saints might also suffer, as there was little distinction between different people. Indeed, as Sulpicius Severus notes, judgments at that time were based merely on appearance. Someone could be deemed heretical because of their paleness or clothing. These matters greatly displeased Martin when he arrived at the council. Thus, it is no surprise that after the Synod of Trier, he decided to avoid such gatherings religiously in the future, and refused to attend them for the rest of his life. Regarding the year of this holy man's death, there is, as Dionysius Petavius mentions, significant disagreement among ancient writers. Gregory of Tours, in chapter 46, recounts that he died at midnight on a Sunday, under the consulship of Caesarius and Atticus. Petavius adds that this year was 397. However, in that year, the Sunday letter was D, meaning November 11th was on a Wednesday, not a Sunday. Sigebert, followed by the Ecclesiastical Annals, assigns the year 402. But in that year, the letter was E, making November 11th a Tuesday. Therefore, he either died in the year 400, when the Sunday letters were A and C, making November 11th a Monday, or in 401, when it was a Tuesday. If we accept the former, he died on the night before Sunday. If the latter suits us, it was on the night following Sunday. In the year 401, Severus Sulpicius suggests that Martin lived for 16 years after the consulship of Evodius, which was in the year 386. This places the 16th year in 401. Gregory of Tours, in Book 2, Chapter 43, notes the year 400 when he states that Clovis died 112 years after Martin's death, which happened in the year 511. The learned Dionysius Petavius discusses this in his work Rational Accounts of Time, second part, Chapter 13, but his conjectures do not contribute to our study. It's well established that Maximus the tyrant met a grim end at Aquileia, defeated by Theodosius and Valentinian. As Prosper notes in the Chronicle, he was stripped of his royal garments and sentenced to death. His son Victor was also killed that same year, a few days later, by Arbogast in Gaul. Meanwhile, as Petavius adds, Andragothius threw himself into the sea. The deaths of these figures are mentioned by Aidatius and the esteemed Prosper during the consulship of Theodosius II and Gynegus, which, according to the Church's tables, is the year 388.
Chapter 7.
On the councils of Toledo convened due to the Priscillianists. As we trace the course of events, we must acknowledge how, during the 4th century, the Priscillianist movement spread so widely that it misled not just ordinary people, but also those once known for their piety and dignity. Catholic bishops found themselves compelled to confront the dangers of this heresy, so much so that they had to convene multiple times. Initially, they issued a decree against this heresy and its followers, a decree they described as libellous. However, pinpointing the exact time and place of their meetings is challenging. Before the well-known Council of Toledo, Spanish bishops held another council, as clearly stated by the 19 Toledan fathers in the preface of their synod. All these 19 were present, who also issued a decree against Priscillian's followers and the libellous heresy he had established. By using this old Latin expression, the Toledine fathers likely meant that the decree of condemnation was not only spoken but also documented and publicly released. This approach to issuing judgments by the Spanish bishops went unnoticed by Tilleman, Sermond, Pagius, Severinus Binius, Aguirre, and all others who wrote about ecclesiastical judgments in Spain during the 4th century, as they didn't mention the earlier council claimed by the Toledan fathers. Even the most recent writer, Cajetanus Seni, who aimed to document the judgments of the Church of Spain during the 4th century, should have addressed this. Franciscus Gervasius, a priest from Urgel, also didn't mention it in his 2-part dissertation on the history of the Priscillianists, published last year in Rome. However, since these distinguished and learned men had different writing goals, they didn't have the opportunity to address every detail. Pope Cajetan Seni was committed to asserting and defending the supreme authority of the Roman pontiffs over churches worldwide. During discussions, he focused intensely on this goal, either not considering or completely overlooking the acts of the First Council of Toledo. A later writer aimed to briefly outline the origin, growth, and end of the Priscillianists in an organized manner, ignoring details he found irrelevant to his purpose. Consequently, Patronus, along with 18 other Spanish bishops, rightly condemned the impious doctrines of Priscillian and his followers in writing. After some years, they decided to reconvene in Toledo to address issues necessary for ecclesiastical discipline, resolve scandals, eliminate schism, and ultimately secure complete harmony. With the presbyters seated, the deacons standing by, and others gathered, Bishop Patronus stated, Since each of us has begun to do different things in our churches, leading to scandals and schism, if it pleases you, let us decide together what should be followed by all bishops regarding the ordination of clerics. Upon reading the Acts and Canons of this Toledo Synod and comparing them with Pope Siricius's letter to Hymerius of Tarragona and other Spanish bishops, I found everything aligns perfectly. The Fathers decreed nothing different from what the Supreme Pontiff had already commanded them to observe with apostolic authority in the year 385, or what had long been established in the Council of Nicaea concerning ordinations. It appears that the bishops of Spain consistently consulted the Roman seat when making decisions within the Church and never strayed from its rules. It's quite surprising that previously celebrated authors did not notice or chose not to highlight such a strong and significant alignment in these records. We mention this not to criticize these otherwise excellent writers who have greatly contributed to literary matters, but to reinforce the arguments they present against innovators. Regarding the timing of the First Council of Toledo, the various questions raised there, and the authenticity of the Acts, there is no consensus among church writers. Baronius, in particular, claims that this council was convened only in the fourth year of Pope Innocent I's pontificate, which is the year 405, based on the belief that Innocent himself wrote a letter to the bishops of this synod, bearing the heading, Innocent to the bishops of the Synod of Toledo. Although the Acts of the Toledo Council themselves contradict Baronius's conjectures, as they are titled, The Toledo Council of 19 bishops held during the time of Anastasius, Honorius, and Arcadius, with Stilicho as consul in the year 438 of the Spanish era, the year 400 AD, with Bishop Patron presiding on the seventh day before the Ides of September. He argues that an error crept into this, suggesting that these acts should be attributed not to the first but to the second consulship of Stilicho, which falls in the year 405. Thus, Baronius insists on the letter of Innocent, setting aside the title and inscription of the Toledo Synod, not considering the name of President Petruinus, the Spanish era, the pontificate of Anastasius, or the Christian epoch of the year 400 as needing to be verified. But now it is clear that the learned man is mistaken, not only through all published and manuscript copies but also through the letter of Pope St. Innocent himself. What then? The Holy Bishop, indeed, discusses the synod where Gregory of Merida was appointed to replace Patronus and orders that Gregory's grievances be addressed. However, at the Toledo Synod we're discussing, Patronus, who was still alive, participated and even presided, as you'll understand from the entire series of Acts. On the other hand, Pope Innocent wrote about Patronus in a specific part of his letter. If there is any complaint from Gregory, the Bishop of Merida, who was appointed in place of the venerable Patruinus, let it be addressed. If he suffered injustice against his merit, let it be rectified to prevent envy from undermining another's honor, so that the spirit of division does not arise against any good men. These words clearly show that many Spanish writers were mistaken. Some thought Patronus or Patruinus, the president of the Toledo Synod, was the Bishop of Toledo, while others believed he was of Braga. From these words, it's clear they didn't realize he was the Bishop of Merida, whom Gregory succeeded 5 years after his death. Therefore, we had to approach this discussion differently, as we believe that Pope Innocent's letter should not be linked to the First Toledo Synod but to the Second. This was pointed out some time ago by Sermondus, Pagius, Petavius, Severinus Binnaeus, Tilemon, and other writers, although they were not all guided by the same reasons and speculations. Some reasonably suggested that the First Toledo Synod should be dated to the year 399 AD or the following year. We will not delve further into this, as we now face something more complex and obscure, investigating the reasons that prompted Patronus, or Patruinus, to convene the First Toledo Synod. Indeed, the remaining records from that era suggest there were many significant reasons. Since church writers have not adequately recorded them, we are compelled to explore these details to avoid being seen as neglectful or overly complacent. We want to make it clear that the main reason for holding the council in the city of Toledo was due to a significant schism caused by the Priscillian heresy. It's uncertain whether this was the same faction stirred up by Ithacius or another one entirely. What is well known and undeniable is that the ecclesiastical matters in the Spanish provinces, concerning doctrine, morals, and discipline, were severely disrupted and weakened by this Priscillian corruption. Even bishops and other clergy, straying from the rules of the Holy Fathers, began following what suited their own interests more. There was such discord among them and such varied behavior that they accepted repentant individuals without any selection whatsoever. They promoted to higher holy orders those who were married or living with concubines and having children. They accepted bigamists, those engaged in secular military service, and servants bound to masters into church ministries. Some freely associated with those who were excommunicated and anathematized. Others, having left their own churches, were not compelled to return under the threat of deposition. Finally, Some abused either the company of religious women or the sacred Eucharist, married the widows of deceased bishops and priests, and committed many other acts of equal gravity. This not only undermined the sanctions of the canons through the misuse of the wicked but even endangered the divine and apostolic commands themselves. The following parts of the previous chapter or canon clearly reveal that a different council on these same issues was held a little earlier by the Lusitanians. The Fathers of Toledo state that it was decided that deacons, if they are not virtuous, chaste, and living a continent life, even if they have wives, should be established in ministry. However, if any lived incontinently with their wives before the restrictions set by the Lusitanian bishops, they should not be elevated to the honor of the priesthood. Let's move past the decrees or prohibitions of this Portuguese council. The acts of that council are highly sought after by scholars, and even Cardinal Aguirre, a diligent collector of Spanish matters, couldn't describe them in detail. So, let's focus on another issue from the Toledo Council. There have been notable writers on this topic, including Tilemon and Pascasius Quesnellis. Their focus is primarily on Bishop Symphasius, Dictinius, and other clerical members who, after leaving the Priscillian heresy, were accepted into communion by the Fathers of the First Synod of Toledo, thanks to Ambrose and the Roman Pontiff. First, we find that the heart of the controversy involves many aspects. To better separate doubts from certainties and falsehoods from authentic accounts, let's introduce various points. It is understood from the acts of this council that Symphasius, along with 11 other bishops, subscribed to the Council of Saragossa in 381 AD, and declared anathema against Priscillian and his doctrines. However, if we claim that only one council was held in Saragossa, it implies they withdrew from communion with the other fathers, as we will discuss later. Therefore, Symphasius couldn't have been tainted by that severe plague at that time, nor was he publicly accused of this heresy in 385 AD, when Priscillian and his associates were punished with death or exile by the decree of the tyrant Maximus. Indeed, Severus Sulpicius, who describes the entire matter in Book 2 of his history, lists the names of the heresy's author and his associates without mentioning Symphasius. Although arguments based on a writer's silence are generally weak and given little weight, in this context, it holds significant strength. We shouldn't, therefore, accuse Severus Sulpicius of negligence or carelessness. Could he have remained silent about the name of this most famous bishop, who documented the names of others in this sacred order, noted the fall of Igenius, or Idigenius, of Córdoba, after the Toledo Synod, and explicitly named even men and women of the lowest class to provide full knowledge of these matters? This brings us to the third point, which is that Symphasius only openly embraced heresy after Priscillian's death, with the Ithacian schism on the rise, and the affairs of Spain changing due to the death of the tyrant Maximus. Therefore, before the year 389 AD, Symphasius could not have been considered a Priscillianist. He would not have escaped the harsh bodily punishments that the tyranny, lust, and greed of imperial tribunals strictly enforced throughout the provinces of Spain against Priscillian's followers, even to the extent of applying the death penalty. So, we should not assume that Symphasius miraculously escaped the investigation of the imperial tribunals. It must be admitted that he and his son Dictinius, while Maximus the tyrant was still alive, outwardly at least pretended to hold the Catholic faith. But when they learned that Maximus had died in Aquileia, Symphasius and Dictinius cast off their fear of death and began to publicly teach the Priscillian doctrines, which they might have secretly followed until then, both in speech and writing, to spread them more widely. Among others, Augustine discusses the works of Dictinius in his book Against Lying, addressed to Consentius, where he describes Dictinius's book, called Liber, because it deals with 12 questions, explained as if by hooks, and praises it so highly Dictinius is understood that he attests this Liber, in which terrible blasphemies are contained, to be worth many thousands of pounds of gold. In that book, therefore, Dictinius taught that religious people ought to lie to conceal their religion. The type of argument that the author drew from the Holy Scriptures prompted Augustine to use all his wisdom to refute and dismantle the book, which was harmful to Catholic piety. This was done to protect the sanctity and authority of the divine Scriptures. However, our own Leo mentions that Dictinius also published other treatises supporting the Priscillian heresy, which we will discuss later. Meanwhile, to stay focused on our purpose, we are certain that the downfall of Symphasius and Dictinius should be dated no earlier than the 5th or 6th year of Siricius's pontificate. Their impiety, known among the bishops of Spain and Lusitania and confirmed by the works of Dictinius, led Catholics to begin distancing themselves from communion with them. At a certain bishop's council, they were condemned with an anathema, as I believe. However, since ancient writers remained silent on this obscure matter, we will not speculate further. Turning to the Chronicle of Idatius, we will briefly explain when Symphasius and Dictinius returned to communion with the Catholics. Idatius, a meticulous chronicler of Spanish affairs, states that during the pontificate of Anastasius, a council in Toledo saw both Symphacius and Dictinius, along with other bishops from Galatia, renounce the Priscillian heresy and condemn it with a signed profession of faith. Anastasius is noted as the 37th bishop of the Roman Church. In the Carthaginian province, in Toledo, a synod of bishops was convened. The Acts show that Symphacius and Dictinius, along with other bishops from Galatia who followed Priscillian, condemned his heresy by signing their profession of faith. Additionally, it is noted that certain guidelines were established regarding the discipline of the Church, with Bishop Ortigus, ordained by Galensis, participating in the council. However, due to the actions of the Priscillianists, he was exiled, forced out by factions opposing the Catholic faith. It's remarkable that neither ancient nor more recent writers have recognized such a notable testimony. Some have focused on different aspects regarding the causes, timing, and events of the council. Even more astonishing is that supporters of various opinions don't rely on the same principles, as each either follows their own studies, or, as if guessing, strays further from the truth on this significant matter. I do not intend to challenge Baronius or the collectors of the councils, who have dedicated time and effort to organizing and presenting such a vast collection of sacred texts and Christian resources. Despite their efforts, they haven't always been able to examine everything firsthand or align them with the highest critical standards. Our focus is rather on those who have published commentaries on Baronius or on the councils. Pagius, Severinus Binius, Cardinal Aguirre, Sermundus, Belusius, and other scholars of ancient history have determined the legitimate timing of the Council of Toledo, but have remained silent on other events that occurred there. Tillemon examined the reasons for convening the council and speculated much about Symphacius and Dictinius, referencing letters from St. Ambrose, Numbers 52 and 56, which do not mention the Priscillianists or those two bishops. Cajetan Ceni aimed to shed light on the ecclesiastical history of the first 8 centuries, particularly focusing on the forms of ecclesiastical judgment observed in the Spanish Church. However, a learned man barely touches on the topics related to the time of the Council of Toledo, completely ignoring the rest. This leaves a large area open for us and others, which Dictinius and Symphacius had explored to assert and defend the authority of the Apostolic Pontifical See. In this context, those who have read the preface by Ceni will surely agree that he stayed true to his original purpose.
Chapter 8.
To challenge the mistaken views of some, especially those of Pascasius Quesnellus, we revisit the cases of bishops Symphacius and Dictinius more thoroughly using ecclesiastical records. Although I have already spent considerable time examining the acts of the councils of Saragossa and Toledo regarding the case and condemnation of the Priscillianists, I believe it is crucial to delve deeper into the matters concerning bishops Symphacius and Dictinius, who were once associated with the Priscillian heresy. Some modern writers have discussed these two bishops, and Pascasius Quesnellus is particularly noteworthy among them. While preparing the works of St. Leo the Great, he let his own biases influence him. Driven not by a desire for truth, but by a passion for argument, he tried to distort the sequence of ecclesiastical events, either by carelessly overlooking ancient records or by misinterpreting them. Ultimately, he sought to dismantle the traditional discipline of the Church and establish a new system of governance and economy. In his notes and observations on the 15th letter of St. Leo the Great, he examines with particular diligence the case of the Priscillianists and the councils held against them, focusing on the period when Symphacius and Dictinius either fell into heresy or were welcomed back into the Church's communion. If Quesnellian conjectures were credible, many things we have proven as certain would fall into disarray. But this writer, proceeding cautiously, places the fall of both Symphacius and Dictinius before the Council of Saragossa in 231. Both were accused of this heresy at the Caesar Augustine Synod in the year 381 against Priscillian, from which judgment Symphacius is said to have withdrawn, avoiding the sentence of the First Synod of Toledo. I believe this is the first assertion of Quesnellus that warrants skepticism. The final decision, read after the Acts of the First Council of Toledo, from which he certainly based his opinion, does not align at all with these words. It is stated there that Symphacius kept an open mind in the pursuit of truth, but only spent one day at the Council of Saragossa and later refused to listen to the decision by not attending further. How this can be consistent with the history of the Priscillianists is completely unclear to me. It is certain that Bishop Symphacius signed the Council of Saragossa in the year 381. Therefore, the mentioned words must refer to another council held in Saragossa, which many have suspected, but its acts do not exist. Moreover, what follows seems to contradict the preceding statements, for they say, "It would be difficult for us to hear those already mentioned, yet by the letters from the sacred memory of Ambrose, which he sent to us after that council, that if they had condemned what they had wrongly done and fulfilled the conditions which the letters prescribed, reverently to peace, add what Pope Siricius of sacred memory had advised, we showed great patience. Quesnellus translated this entire narrative into his view, without considering whether it aligned with the other certain monuments of the history of the Priscillianists or not. If we recall what we excerpted earlier from Severus Sulpicius, we find a somewhat different approach in Ambrose on the same matter. Indeed, he did not hear or receive Priscillian, Instantius, and others of this sect, who refused to attend that Saragossa synod in 381, although they went to Milan, nor did he send any letters to the Catholic bishops of Spain for their reception. How then could it be that the same Ambrose, after that same Saragossa council, would have heard, received, and prescribed conditions for penance to Bishop Symphacius and his son Dictinius and others, who were undermined by the same habits and vices? However, there's another aspect praised in this account that doesn't align with the time of the Council of Saragossa. It commends the decrees of Pope Saint Siricius regarding the reconciliation of repentant heretics. Ambrose himself couldn't set any conditions by law other than those decreed by the apostolic authority of the Supreme Pontiff. The very holy Bishop of Milan and the other bishops of that province, already gathered in a council, acknowledged that no one excluded from the Church could legitimately re-enter unless the supreme gatekeeper, the successor of St. Peter, opened the door. Thus, Ambrose, writing back to Siricius and the others gathered in the council, begins the letter like this: "We have recognized in the letters of your holiness the vigilance of a good shepherd, who diligently guards the gate entrusted to you and with pious care watches over the flock of Christ, etc." Following these principles, Ambrose should have advised the bishops of Spain to receive Symphacius and Dictinius, who were repentant, only under the conditions that the Apostolic See had already decreed. But since Siricius' decrees of this kind weren't issued until at least 4 years after that Council of Saragossa, specifically in the year 385, on February 11, during the consulship of Arcadius and Bodo, I cannot convince myself that the case of Symphacius and Dictinius was reviewed in the Council of Saragossa in the year 381, and that both withdrew from the judgment of those bishops. If we accept the slander canal invents and the claim that they withdrew from the judgment of the Fathers of Saragossa in 381, then Symphacius and Dictinius, as defiant ones, would have inevitably been summoned to the Synod of Bordeaux, and if they refused to attend, they would have faced the same penalty as Instantius and Priscillian. Why say more? They would not have escaped the sword of the tyrant Maximus and certainly wouldn't have kept themselves safe from the fury of the imperial tribunals, as we noted a little earlier. The Synod of Bordeaux was held in the year 385, under the same consuls. During this synod, there was no mention of the defamation and insolence of Symphacius and Dictinius, as indicated by the silence of Sulpicius Severus. To avoid any such fabrication, it's important to affirm that either through the scribes' incompetence, these words crept into the records. After the Council of Saragossa, where judgment had been pronounced on certain individuals, but only on one day, when Symphacius was present, he later avoided hearing the judgment by refusing to attend. Alternatively, it should be related to something other than the council held in 381. We believe this could have only happened after the death of Priscillian, Instantius, and others. Cardinal Aguirre, based on various conjectures, in Volume 2 of the Councils of Spain, claims that another council was held in Saragossa in 383, separate from the First Saragossa Council, which we cannot support. We argue it was convened later. Although this issue is surrounded by many uncertainties, the additional details in the praised example of the definitive judgment offer significant insight to get closer to the truth. It is recorded that Symphacius, in the presence and hearing of St. Ambrose, accepted and set these conditions, that he had already withdrawn and would forever withdraw from the recitation of those called martyrs. Meanwhile, Dictinius, having obtained ecclesiastical peace, was to hold the position of the presbytery and not receive an increase in honor, as Pope Siricius decreed in his earlier letter about the penitents who had lapsed. Clearly, all those conjectures collapsed that claimed Symphacius and his son Dictinius had lapsed before the slaughter of the Priscillianists. Sulpicius Severus, recounting the events of that slaughter, noted that not only was the heresy not suppressed, which had emerged with that author, but it was confirmed and spread more widely, for his followers, who had previously honored him as a saint, later began to venerate him as a martyr. The bodies of those killed were brought back to Spain, and their funerals were held with great honor. In the aftermath of Priscillian and his companions' execution, the Catholic religion began to be defiled more impiously and superstitiously, as those executed for serious crimes were regarded and venerated as true martyrs. This event so disturbed church affairs that many bishops, who led more virtuous lives, abhorred this kind of judgment and vengeance, and appeared to defend Priscillian's cause. They refused communion with the killers, namely Ithacius and others, pronounced anathemas against them, and removed them from their episcopal seats, horrified by such a grave and bloody crime. From this Catholic schism, the Priscillianists seized the opportunity to spread their sect further, claiming sacred martyr honors for the bodies of the slain and introducing this impious custom into the churches. The names of these individuals were recited alongside those of other martyrs during divine services. Symphacius fell into madness, deceived and misled by many, as the copies of his definitive sentence reveal. However, among Priscillian's doctrines, Symphacius only professed two: that God is unbegotten and that there are two principles of visible things. He never used any apocryphal books or new sciences composed by Priscillian. Although Dictinius, almost led astray by some letters, condemned them all with his profession, seeking correction, and asked for forgiveness at the council in Toledo. Thus, all these matters have such an influence on us that we are not persuaded by Canel's opinion. Specifically, the notion that Symphacius was defamed in 381 at the Synod in Saragossa and withdrew from the judgment of those fathers as a Priscillianist. He could hardly have earned the gift of ecclesiastical reconciliation for himself if he had stubbornly persisted in his defiance for 19 years, the time between that and this Council of Toledo. Now, let's move on to other matters which, due to the loss of ancient records, are equally obscure and filled with many difficulties. Both ancient and modern writers agree that Ambrose was approached as a mediator of peace and reconciliation by Symphacius and others who had fallen. However, it's not clearly established in which year Ambrose received them in Milan, having given them letters of communication. Under certain prescribed and accepted conditions, the Catholic bishops of Spain, who had separated themselves from the communion of those who had fallen, would admit them to peace and ecclesiastical reconciliation. What those letters from the divine Ambrose to the bishops of Spain contained cannot be fully understood, as they have been lost to time. It is only evidenced by the acts of this Council of Toledo held in the year 400, that they were read in a previous Synod of Toledo, to which Symphacius, Dictinius, and the others who had fallen refused to come. Ambrose acted as a mediator under those conditions, so Symphacius refrained from the duty of ordination, and Dictinius, his son, remained permanently in the rank of priesthood. This ensured that he and other clerics of equal or lower order could never ascend to higher ranks of the Church. But two things certainly occurred that were entirely opposed to peace and ecclesiastical reconciliation. First, all who approached Ambrose refused to condemn before the Synod of the Spanish bishops what they had wrongly done, as the Bishop of Milan, relying on the statutes of the Apostolic See, had prescribed should be done. Then they withdrew from the state and purpose of penitence against their given word. When the Bishop of Astorga passed away, Symphacius appointed his son Dictinius to that position, consecrating him as bishop. Together, Dictinius and Symphacius ordained many others as bishops in the province of Galicia, even though their faith was not thoroughly proven. The record of all these actions is included in the example of the final decree, which was issued at the Council of Toledo in the year 400. Now, we need to investigate the timing of that Council of Toledo. During this council, after reading the letters of Ambrose, those who had repented were to be admitted to the peace of reconciliation, from which Symphacius and others withdrew. It's more likely that this occurred before Ambrose's death. Paulinus, in his Life of Ambrose, states, Ambrose lived nearly 3 years after Theodosius, the most Christian emperor. He writes that Ambrose passed away on Holy Saturday, and Petavius adds that it was on April 4, in the year 397 AD, during the consulship of Caesarius and Atticus. However, Marcellinus attributes his death to the next year, 398, under the consulship of Honorius and Eutychianus. Therefore, the council couldn't have been gathered long before the death of St. Ambrose. All those 19 bishops who directed their judgment against the absent rebels were still alive in the year 400, which would have been unlikely if a long period had passed between that council and the one at Toledo. Paschasius Quesnellus ignored these and similar details. Following his usual approach, he used conjectures, distinguishing several councils of Toledo. He placed the first one between the Council of Saragossa in 381, and the Council of Toledo in 400, without considering the one held at Bordeaux, or at Trier, or possibly another at Saragossa, which certainly preceded all the Toledo assemblies. But let's move past these points, so we don't seem to be nitpicking by arguing over minor issues with Quesnellus. So, let's shift our focus to where we find the more serious errors of Quesnellus. We believe that mistakes like these are significant, as highlighted in Letter 15 of St. Leo. In the previous edition of these works, Paschasius Quesnellus suggested that Dictinius was removed from his episcopal position due to the Priscillian heresy, and that Turrebius later took over. This error stemmed from the following words, which he claimed to quote from the Chronicle of Idatius. Dictinius, bishop of Asturica, removed because of the Priscillian heresy, which he professed, along with other bishops of the same sect, was succeeded by Turribius. We also discovered that monks from the congregation of St. Maur made a similar mistake. In their edition of the works of St. Augustine, perhaps relying too heavily on Quesnellus or another unreliable source, they asserted the same claim from Idasius's chronicle. However, this contradicted the words of Augustine elsewhere, which state that Dictinius died among the Catholic bishops of the Church. Ferrarius also wrote that Dictinius is listed among the saintly bishops of the Church of Asturica and that his memory was celebrated there every year on June 2. Nevertheless, it would be unfair to deny Paschasius Quesnellus his due credit, as he did acknowledge, upon reviewing the praised chronicle of Idasius, that he had experienced a lapse of memory or a hallucination in the first edition. He retracted his previous statements in another edition, though some might say he did so too cunningly. Who could fail to be amazed at the brilliance of a man who, throughout his life, refused to depart from the words and writings he had previously stated against the articles of the Catholic faith? However, it is well known that this was typical behavior for heretics and schismatics of this nature. Often, when dealing with history and similar topics that add little to their system, they failed due to ignorance, negligence, and arrogance. However, it wasn't hard for them to later retract their errors, correct them, and cover them with some semblance of truth to win over the honest minds among their followers, whom they wished to deceive in matters of faith and morals. Yet, Quesnellus didn't fully correct this error in his latest edition. He sincerely admitted, almost as if under oath, that those words were missing in the Idasian chronicle and were not invented by him. Nevertheless, he decided that the fragment, along with its foundations, should remain in the latest edition, hoping it might one day catch the attention of learned readers and be brought to the typographer to be added to this history. While he held this opinion, he convinced himself that the fragment was not a forgery but should be attributed to an unknown author. Like a dreamer, he imagines many false and fabricated things that undermine the histories of the Catholic Church and the Priscillianists, make the credibility and authority of the councils of Toledo too suspect, and, more seriously, distorts and corrupts the meaning of the Idasian chronicle, which he himself praises highly, with his erroneous interpretations. But to ensure I'm not making things up from my own opinion, I will immediately refute each point that Quesnellus presents. First, I ask, where does this writer claim that Dictinius was already deposed from his Asturian see before the year 400, and that Saint Turribius was immediately appointed in his place? Again, where does he claim that Dictinius, with the consent of the Toledan fathers, reclaimed his first see, which, contrary to the 235 canons of the Church, imagines two bishops managing the same see? Furthermore, Idasius in his chronicle says nothing of this, nor do the Toledan fathers, who did not mention the reinstatement of Dictinius or the ordination of Turribius. Indeed, that chronicle and the acts of this council harmonize remarkably with each other, particularly in mentioning the pardon granted to Dictinius and the other penitent bishops, allowing them to keep their positions as long as they refrained from ordaining bishops, priests, and deacons, until they received letters of communion from Anastasius, the Roman Pope, and Simplicianus, the Bishop of Milan, successor of Ambrose. The Toledan bishops noted that Symphacius, an elderly and devout man, should stay in his church, exercising greater caution with those entrusted to him, as he awaited communion from where he first hoped for future peace. We also agreed that this should apply to Dictinius and Antherius. So, when the Toledan fathers decided that Symphacius, Dictinius, and Antherius should remain in their churches, wasn't it incorrect for Quesnellus to claim that Dictinius was removed from his position before that council, with Turribius appointed in his place? They said, let them remain, not let them reclaim their seats, which clearly shows, even to a somewhat attentive person, that these words mean different things. Therefore, it is not credible that Turribius was appointed in Dictinius's place while he was still alive. Dictinius remained in the Asturian Church from the day of his consecration until his death. In this context, Quesnellus's two conjectures and suspicions fall apart as weak, whether regarding the idea of two bishops administering the same church simultaneously, which is forbidden by sacred canons, or concerning the age of Turribius, which would have been extreme if his ordination occurred before the year 400, since he was still alive, and capable of arduous journeys in the year 447 during the pontificate of Leo the Great, as gathered from his letter, which we will discuss in the following chapters. However, regarding Turribius's ordination, we cannot determine anything definitively from the surviving records. We have one confirmed fact from Augustine: his predecessor Dictinius passed away before the year 420. In that year, when the Holy Father wrote a book against lying to Consentius, he mentioned Dictinius had died with these words. To praise either the known life or the unknown reputation of Bishop Dictinius falsely is still more tolerable because he is thought to have been Catholic and corrected from that error. We cannot rely solely on the testimony of Idatius, who wrote during the 306th Olympiad. In the city of Asturica in Galicia, certain Manichaeans who had been hiding for several years were discovered in episcopal records, which were sent by Idatius and Turribius, who heard them, to Anthony, Bishop of Emerita. I don't understand how Quesnellus claims that the term Manichaeans actually refers to Priscillianists, since Idatius never confused Priscillianists with Manichaeans in his chronicle, even though both heresies were branches of the Gnostics. For example, during the 24th Olympiad, after describing the execution of Priscillian and his companions, he added, "Then the heresy of the Priscillianists invaded Galicia." Again, during the 294th Olympiad, speaking of Ortigus, who had been ordained at Chalene, he added, "But with the Priscillianists acting, he was exiled due to factions against the Catholic faith." Idatius used the same language when discussing the letter of St. Leo the Great to Turribius of Asturica, saying, "Leo, the 43rd bishop of the Roman Church, presides. His writings were delivered by Bishop Turribius's deacon Provincus against the Priscillianists to the bishops of Hispalis." After considering all these points, I find it difficult to agree with Quesnellus's opinion that Idatius intended to identify Priscillianists as Manichaeans in the previously mentioned passage of the same Olympiad. It is clear to us and others who read that chronicle that he referred to the heretics of both sects by their proper names. A little later, while discussing a certain Manichaean named Pasentius from Rome, who had fled from Asturica, he specifically names him as a Manichaean. Bishop Antonius of Emerita had captured and even expelled him from the province of Lusitania. But who would claim that this man was a Priscillianist? In Rome, especially during the time of Leo, the Priscillianist plague was rampant. However, even if it's freely granted that Idatius called such heretics Manichaeans there, what does it matter? There's no doubt that Turribius succeeded Dictinius in the bishopric after his death. Therefore, his diligence, along with Idatius, the bishop of Lemica, in uncovering Manichaeans does not mean Dictinius didn't remain on the Asturican throne until his death. It doesn't prove he was expelled from his seat, nor does it show that the church was managed by two bishops. When Dictinius died, either Zosimus or Boniface held the Roman seat, and when Turbius and Idatius acted against the hidden Manichaeans, Pope Leo was already the pontiff, as Idatius confirms in his praised chronicle.
Chapter 9.
On the Council of Toledo, where Symphasius and Dictinius were accepted as penitents, and on the schism in Galicia caused by this, reflections and considerations on Quesnellian theories are noted and rejected. Setting aside Quesnellian theories for now, we aim to focus on other matters. Specifically, we'll examine the acts of the Council of Toledo, the events related to this case, and the significant schism that arose mainly in the province of Galicia. This occurred after the Fathers of Toledo received and absolved Symphasius, Dictinius, and other bishops and priests who were previously involved with the Priscillian heresy. Some envious individuals or those overly committed to maintaining ecclesiastical discipline became aware of this. As for the acts, anyone who examines them, as published by the collectors of the councils, will find them to be very incomplete and imperfect, a point that has gone unnoticed until now. The following example, which we provide, makes this clear. We believe no error has crept into the heading, except perhaps one from the collectors, who call this the First Council of Toledo. However, Patronus, in his preface, asserts that another council was already held there by the same 19 bishops, as we noted earlier. Furthermore, Idatius clearly indicated in his chronicle, during the reign of Pope Anastasius and under Emperors Honorius and Arcadius, when Stilicho was first appointed consul, that this council was convened during the 294th Olympiad. The title of the chapters follows this heading, containing only a brief summary of what was decreed to restore church discipline there. But here an error has already crept in, as the mentioned titles, also noted in Roman numerals, indicate that more than 21 chapters were established. However, the last chapter, which was about the rules of the Catholic faith against the Priscillianists, is completely missing. The preface of the council is attached to these chapter titles, mentioning the names of the first 19 bishops gathered in Toledo in the year 237, but it doesn't specify the churches they led. After listing them faithfully, Patronus, the bishop of Emerita and president of the assembly, delivered a serious and brief speech. He lamented that church discipline had declined in the provinces of Spain, and that scandals among the clergy had become so widespread, they caused a serious schism. To address these issues, Patronus sought a definition from the Common Council on what all bishops should follow when ordaining clergy. Then, as the first among them, he made this statement: "I believe that the decrees of the Nicene Council should be observed perpetually and not deviated from. Indeed, All the other bishops agreed with Petronius's statement unanimously, also deciding that those who dared to act otherwise than what was decreed should be punished with the penalty of anathema. Besides these, the preface contains nothing further. Then, as we mentioned, only 20 chapters or canons follow, which are most suitable for the troubled affairs of those times. They served both to cleanse the spreading corruption of those days and to prevent it from spreading further, so as not to undermine the still intact churches and Catholics. It's unfortunate that after the 20th chapter, which discusses how only a bishop can prepare chrism, the next thing is the bishop's signatures. This suggests that a part of the Council of Toledo's proceedings is missing, or perhaps it's been displaced from its original context, leaving us without a complete history of Priscillian as organized by the Church Fathers. This significant gap can only be somewhat filled by the acts of another council, after the deaths of Symphasius, Dictinius, and others involved in the Priscillian heresy. These fathers might have gathered in Toledo. They were cautious not to make hasty judgments about past heresies and schisms and decided to thoroughly investigate the events surrounding the Priscillianists. During this gathering, they ordered excerpts from the previous Toledo Synod's definitions to be read publicly to inform the new assembly. However, since existing church records don't specify when or why these acts were removed and recited at a later council, it's impossible to pinpoint the exact time. It's clear, though, that excerpts from the genuine acts were made after Symphasius, Dictinius, and Camasius had passed away. The later council's words provide evidence. After the council was held on the 1st of September, and after various inquiries, on the 8th day of the Ides of September, the statements of the late bishops Symphasius and Dictinius, and Camasius, then a presbyter, were taken from the full acts. This was part of the Council of Toledo's records concerning the condemnation of Priscillian or his sect. Who would really believe that those bishops of blessed memory, and that priest, were present at the council if they were still alive at that time? Surely, the life or death of bishops wouldn't be unknown to other bishops from the same region, city, or nation. So, it's reasonable to believe they had passed away when the copies of those declarations were torn away and publicly read at a much later council. But Quesnellus suspected these copies might suggest fabrication, and we think Stephanus Belugius shared this suspicion. However, no one has clearly shown where or how the claims of fabrication could or should be substantiated. For Quesnellus, who pointed out some signs of forgery in his notes on the 15th letter of St. Leo, veered off the main point and made many baseless and weak arguments. For example, he referred to the bishops Symphasius and Dictinius as of blessed memory, which, while perhaps acceptable elsewhere, seems odd in a declaration where they renounce heresy. Are you so particular, Quesnellus, that you think it's wrong to call them men of blessed memory if, after being tainted by heresy, they later repented, renounced their errors, reconciled with the Church, and ultimately died in peace? In fact, the entire history of Christian affairs, sacred records, and ancient church documents would fall apart and be considered full of fabrications. For in ancient times, as now, that expression was used to signify the ecclesiastical peace and communion in which those who had died were remembered. They weren't deprived of the words of blessed memory because of heresy or schism they had fallen into, as long as they died penitent and were restored to communion before passing. Indeed, such individuals, after receiving the sacrament of reconciliation, were held in high regard, and their names were offered to God at the altar, as is clear from canon law. Consider the decision from the Council of Elvira, where it was determined that the names of those possessed by demons should not be read aloud during sacred mysteries. Also, reflect on the decree from the Council of Emerita, instructing priests, each Sunday, offer a sacrifice to God, and the names of those who built or contributed to these holy churches should be read before the altar during Mass. If they are alive, their names should be mentioned. If they have departed, their names should be read with the faithful departed. Alba Spinaeus and Ferdinand Mendoza provide scholarly evidence that the reading of these names indicated Catholic communion in their notes and observations on the Council of Elvira. However, Quesnellus notes that, although these words of blessed memory might be tolerable, they seem absurd in the profession where heresies are renounced. Dear reader, observe the serious oversight of our commentator Quesnellus. Examine with us the example of the professions issued in the Council of Toledo against the Priscillian sect, and consider what pertains to the last council. The beginning of that example refers to the last council's fathers, who, driven by the desire to seek the truth, consulted the acts of the Synod of Toledo. They ordered the professions of Lord Symphasius and Lord Dictinius, bishops of blessed memory, to be extracted from the complete records. Thus, those two words were placed outside the professions, used by the notaries and fathers of the later council only to indicate the ecclesiastical peace and communion in which Symphasius and Dictinius died. Furthermore, Quesnellus should not assume that the notaries of this council transferred these professions exactly as they were in the original document. Many things omitted by them sufficiently indicate those words. After some time at the same time Bishop Dictinius said, "Listen to me." This is taken from the records of the plenary councils of Toledo, focusing only on those that pertain to the accusation and denunciation of crimes, as spoken by Dictinius, Symphasius, and Camasius. Since the statement begins with the words, "Listen to me, esteemed priests," there is no reason for Quesnellus to accuse it of being fabricated, since everything before these words, including of holy memory, should be attributed to the notary, as will be clear to readers. Let's consider another argument Quesnellus presents for fabrication. He mentions that he barely touched on the errors of Priscillian and his followers, addressing only the non-birth of the Son, the two principles, and the consubstantiality of the soul with the Father. He condemned these ideas in such a way that it seems like they're disguising their intentions, keeping the ability to explain their own beliefs. To add weight to this theory, he refers to St. Leo, aiming to prove the fabrication of the profession from his words. Thirdly, he immediately adds, from the chapter of St. Leo, it is clear they said the Son is born in some sense. From the fifth, they did not explicitly argue that there is one nature of God and man, which Dictinius alone criticized in that profession. Thus, the learned critic insists on these and other similar points to lead the reader to doubt, suggesting that all those professions were fabricated to deceive. This is how Quesnellus reasons. But should we believe all these things to be true? Or should we fear that this clever man might have fabricated some stories too freely, while anxiously investigating the deceit and fabrications of others? The earlier words suggest he shamefully erred, then he barely touched on the errors of Priscillian and his followers. What then? Should they address and confess errors into which they never fell? The example we're discussing doesn't include a profession of faith made by the bishops and priests at the Council of Toledo. Instead, it only contains a confession and renunciation of crimes. They had to specifically renounce the errors of Priscillianism they had followed. Then, they declared anathema on Priscillian himself and all his blasphemies. When they dared to profess from Priscillian's teachings that God is unbegotten, that there is one substance of God and man, or that there are two principles, it was necessary to explicitly confess and renounce these beliefs. They did this without admitting to crimes they never committed. The document is a confession and renunciation of crimes, not a profession of faith, as shown by the words of Dictinius, the first among them to repent. Hear me, esteemed priests, correct everything, for correction has been granted to you. For it is written, to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven have been given, but I ask you to open the keys to the kingdom for us, not the gates of hell. Who would deny that these are the words of a man humbly repenting and earnestly begging for forgiveness and absolution? After this, he individually reveals his crimes. If you will, I lay all these before you. I reproach myself for what I have said, etc. In the same way, he retracted everything he had written, adding, I also criticize and condemn all my presumptions from my writings. Under oath, Dictinius professes to reject everything with all his heart. He condemned what he had written against the faith. These actions, when examined, don't suggest any deception, fraud, or fabrication, especially since those penitents who stood before the synod recited from a written document the profession of faith they accepted from the fathers. After declaring anathema on all the books and teachings of heretics, especially Priscillians, they were absolved and received into communion, as we gather from the definitive sentence record. The claim that he intended to deceive or reserve the right to interpret his own professions is entirely false. Where does the annotator get this idea? In fact, statements made to the council fathers suggest the opposite. I disavow and condemn all presumption of my writings. Or consider these words. God is my witness, and whatever I have written, I reject with all my heart. Except for the name of God, I curse everything. I condemn everything that is found against the faith along with its author. Therefore, the penitents discussed here were not so deceitful and cunning as to mislead or claim the right to explain what opposed the faith. This is unlike Canal and his followers in our time, who, when summoned to the judgment of the Apostolic See and condemned, have too often and too boldly attempted such actions. Finally, our annotator Canal has embarrassed himself by citing St. Leo the Great's words as supposed evidence of his fabricated profession. The Priscillianists indeed claimed, according to Leo, that God is unbegotten. Because the Word became flesh, says the saintly doctor, they do not truly honor this, but pretend to honor it, fasting on the same day as Sunday, the day of Christ's resurrection. They do this because they do not believe that Christ the Lord was born in true human nature, but wish to claim that what seemed to be shown was not real. St. Leo also taught in clear terms that the Priscillianists argued the substance and nature of God and man are one, stating in chapter 5. In the 5th chapter, it is reported that the soul of man is of divine substance, and that the nature of our condition does not differ from the nature of its creator. When I carefully considered these two things, it became clear to me that either Quesnel was overly confident in his studies, or he went through St. Leo's writings so carelessly, as we have often highlighted in these dissertations.
Chapter 10.
On the other bishops and clerics affected by the Priscillianist influence who were either condemned or absolved at the First Council of Toledo. We briefly covered what was necessary regarding Symphacius and Dictinius in the previous chapter. Now, we'll discuss other bishops and clerics also affected by the Priscillianist influence who associated with Symphacius and Dictinius while unrepentant and not absolved by the Church, or who accepted ordination from them. Firstly, let's focus on those who were summoned to the council according to canon law and who appeared before the bishops as requested. Among them was Paternus, as documented in the records, who received a definitive sentence from the council. Prior to his ordination, he was aware of and supported Priscillian's errors. However, after he became the Bishop of Braga, he rejected all the heretical beliefs by studying the works of St. Ambrose. Thus, when Symphacius ordained him contrary to ecclesiastical laws, they allowed him to maintain his position with some leniency, promising that the Fathers of the First Council of Toledo would more fully accept him once the Apostolic See responded. This leniency was similarly extended to Isonius, who had been recently baptized by Symphacius and was immediately promoted to bishop against ecclesiastical rules. The council decided he should not be removed from his position because he professed adherence to the beliefs upheld in the current council. After the fathers of the council made this decision, they examined the case of Vegentius, who had previously been appointed as a bishop before the Council of Saragossa and had likewise condemned Priscillian's books along with the author, as the Acts document about others. However, after later changing his beliefs and wishing to join the Priscillianists, he was deprived of sacred communion. It was agreed to be lenient with him, even though he might have committed a more serious fault. They welcomed him back into full communion with the condition that he would write a sincere profession of faith. However, a different approach was taken with Bishop Herennius and his clergy. Herennius, who chose to follow his own clergy, had declared Priscillian a Catholic and holy martyr without being asked and claimed he remained Catholic to the end, suffering persecution from the bishops. He, along with all his clergy and several bishops, namely Donatus, Acutius, and Aemilius, who chose to follow the company of the lost, were removed from the priesthood. We do not consider this significant issue resolved merely by these decrees and decisions. There were other matters that still needed attention and remedy. Specifically, those who came to the council from Galicia and remained in communion with Symphacius, even while he was tainted by Priscillian's influence. For these individuals, the decree stated that upon receiving the form sent by the council, if they subscribed, they too would remain in the contemplation of heavenly peace, awaiting a response from the current Pope, Holy Simplicianus, Bishop of Milan, and other church leaders. However, if anyone acted boldly and disregarded the council's leniency by not subscribing to the form, they would not retain the churches they held, nor would they communicate with those who, after returning from the synod with given professions, returned to their churches. Furthermore, it was rightfully and deservedly established that it was not permitted for anyone deprived of communion to hold gatherings in women's homes and read the condemned Apocrypha, to ensure that those who communicated with them would not be considered equally impious. The Catholic bishops were specifically reminded not to neglect their responsibilities and duties. They were warned that those who received these responsibilities must be prepared for a stricter judgment. They also announced that Ortygius, the Catholic bishop of Silanus, who had been unjustly removed from his position by the factions and force of the Priscillianists before this council, should be reinstated to his church. This is also noted by Idatius in the Chronicle, referring to the Council of Toledo. These actions were taken by the Fathers of Toledo in the year 399 or 400 to preserve religion, restore ecclesiastical discipline, and promote peace and lasting harmony. The respected Fathers included a condition in these decrees, stating they would offer fuller forgiveness to penitents once the Apostolic See had responded. As we read, this was the approach taken with Vegentius and Paternus. We will also accept them into our communion once the Apostolic See has responded. Regarding the bishops of Galicia who maintained communication with Symphacius, they were instructed to wait for guidance from the current Pope, Saint Simplicianus, the Bishop of Milan, and other church leaders. Concerning Dictinius and Antirius, who were also bishops, it was decided they should be excluded from the sacred ministry of ordination until communion was restored to them through the Pope or Saint Simplicianus. When we encounter such expressions in the Spanish councils, it reflects how the bishops of Spain exhibited great reverence and obedience to the Apostolic See and the Roman pontiffs. They did not consider the judgments issued in councils regarding penitent bishops and clerics to be firm and valid unless they were approved by the authority of the Apostolic See. I understand that the truth is often disliked by heretics and others who are envious, so I need to address their potential objections right away. They might argue that equal respect was given to Bishop Simplicianus of Milan and other priests by the bishops of Spain in the cases involving the Galician bishops, who were always in communion with Symphesius, as well as bishops Dictinius and Antirius. In the latter case, the decision was equally deferred to the holy Bishop Simplicianus of Milan and the Roman pontiff of that time. Critics argue that this practice undermines the authority of the Roman pontiffs by equating it with the authority of other bishops or suggesting that such matters should be resolved by a Roman council. This is the kind of argument they might still make, coming from those who want to disrupt ecclesiastical unity by equating Roman pontiffs with other bishops. However, it's been demonstrated that their efforts in these and similar matters are futile. To set aside other points I've already discussed or will address later, it's well established that the bishops of Toledo did not await letters from Bishop Simplicianus of Milan and the Pope of that time for the same reason. Ambrose, who preceded Simplicianus, had acted as a mediator with the bishops of Spain so that Symphesius and Dictinius could be accepted under the conditions set by Pope Siricius. The bishops of Toledo agreed to Ambrose's wishes, but since he had passed away and Simplicianus had taken his place, and because Symphesius and Dictinius hadn't met the prescribed conditions, whether out of necessity or disdain, their actions were considered void against the canon sanctions. This was indeed a very serious breach of faith, violating sacred canons and committing a crime that led to irregularity and resulted in excommunication. It was important for this to be brought to the Church's attention, where the pastor had taken on the role of mediator, so that those who repented could be absolved. Since Ambrose had already acted as an intercessor with the Catholic bishops of Spain, not to absolve them of all faults, but only under the conditions set by the highest and universal pastor, Siricius, for those returning from heresy, they wrote back regarding Symphesius. He will await communion from the place where he first received the hope of future peace. We decided that this should also apply to Dictinius and Antirius. These words, though referred to the mediator and even the supreme judge, do not imply equal authority for both. In this case, Ambrose only exercised the delegated power of the supreme pontiff, as he did not set the terms for receiving these penitents but suggested they be received according to the prescriptions of Pope Siricius. We are not creating anything new ourselves, but the definitive sentence conveys this. In the letters from the blessed memory of Ambrose, which he sent to us after that council, if they condemned their wrongdoings and fulfilled the conditions in the letters, they could reverently return to peace. Siricius of blessed memory had advised. Why include the words about what Pope Siricius of blessed memory had advised if Ambrose had written to the bishops of Spain on his own authority, and not that of the Apostolic See? The significant decree to the people of Tarraconensis, Carthaginiensis, Baetica, Lusitania, and Galatia, as well as those in nearby provinces, was indeed issued by Siricius, not Ambrose. It stated that forgiveness should be given to penitents, those married twice, or widowers who improperly entered sacred service, provided they recognize it as a great benefit to remain permanently stable in their current position, without expecting promotion. Thus, when it came to accepting fallen penitents, especially as addressed by the Council of Toledo, it pertained to enforcing the decree by Siricius Is. It was essential to consult the Apostolic See for a final decision. Siricius reserved the right of dispensation for those hindered by such irregularities to himself and his successors, not to bishops of any rank or to councils, as his decree clearly stated. Let the chief priests of all provinces know that if we consider anyone from such people should be promoted to sacred orders, regarding both their own status and the status of those they have promoted against our canons and prohibitions, a suitable sentence must be awaited from the Apostolic See. Now, let the defenders of the new ecclesiastical discipline speak, those who boldly attempt to challenge the rights of the Apostolic See, aiming to confine it within the narrowest limits. Would such a serious, holy, and definitive decree have been disregarded by that national council? Or could those 19 fathers, who gathered at the council, known for their piety, learning, and integrity, have ignored or dismissed such a decree? Both scenarios are incredibly unlikely. As Siricius stated, the decree or prohibition against promoting anyone with a heretical past to the bishopric or holy orders was communicated to all the churches of Spain 14 years ago. This was binding not only for the clerics seeking promotion but also for the bishops responsible for ordaining them. So, when Symphesius, Dictinius, Antirius, Vigentinius, and others presented themselves to the synod while doing penance, they had committed acts that could only be absolved by the Apostolic See's indulgence. It was necessary to appeal to it, specifically mentioning the Sirician prohibition. The prohibition from Pope Siricius was issued on the third day before the Ides of February in 385, during the consulship of Arcadius and Boetonius, as noted in the Roman consul's records. However, it's surprising that such important matters, valuable for illuminating church history, haven't been revisited by anyone. Comparing the acts of this council with the previous decrees and canons of Siricius offers a wealth of insights. This letter cannot be accused of forgery or dismissed as one of Isidore's works. Dionysius Exiguus included it in his collection, and it was praised by Charlemagne in the Aachen Capitular of 789 and by Hincmar of Reims in his work, without mentioning the pontifical book where it is read. Here, he made a decree concerning the entire church, but its authority is questioned by many critics. Our admiration grows with Tillemon's liberty, who, having another aim besides defending the rights of the Roman See, encountered the words of the Council of Toledo in parentheses. He decided that what the holy memory of Pope Siricius suggested should be removed from the text, considering them mere additions. However, there is a learned man wasting time, focusing on trivial conjectures. He finds it unreasonable to believe that St. Ambrose acted in that situation, either on the advice of Siricius or because of his delegation, so that Symphesius and Dictinius would be absolved by the Fathers of Toledo. Goodness, Tillemon shouldn't have reasoned in such a way, as it might seem to Canal or others that he wanted to undermine the rights of bishops and assert the legitimate rights of the Apostolic See. Therefore, the learned man should not cling to or defend the prejudices of others. But, please, let him say whether those decrees of Siricius could have been hidden from both Ambrose and the bishops of Spain, or completely disregarded by them. To assert or suspect either is highly improbable. The letters of Ambrose to Pope Siricius clearly show the depth of the reverence and submission he had toward the Apostolic See, and how much he praised the Roman pontiff for condemning those heretics. Therefore, when Ambrose was dealing with the bishops of Spain about receiving Symphesius and Dictinius as penitents, he couldn't ignore the conditions already set by Pope Siricius, nor could the Spanish bishops understand, inquire, and judge the cause of the penitents except under the same conditions laid out in the Sirician statutes. Therefore, in the decree of the definitive sentence issued by the Fathers of Toledo, it was necessary to express these words. However, by the letters of the holy memory of Ambrose, if they had condemned what they had done wrong and fulfilled the conditions prescribed by the letters, they would reverently return to peace, which the holy memory of Pope Siricius had advised greatly, etc. If they had failed to do this, they could have been reproached and punished not only for irreverence but also for schism and stubbornness. To ensure I'm not wasting time with Tillemon or the opponents of the Apostolic See, let's set aside the decrees of Siricius and the records of the Council of Toledo for now. I want to focus on what occurred in the provinces of Spain following these events.
Chapter 11.
On the serious schism among the Spanish that arose after the Synod of Toledo. Pope Innocent's letters reveal that a significant schism erupted soon after the Synod, due to the pardon granted to bishops and clergy who repented and rejected the Priscillianist heresy and its writings, or because indulgence was denied to the obstinate. The schism's instigators were the bishops from Boetica and Carthage, who were upset that the Fathers of Toledo accepted Symphesius, Dictinius, and other bishops of Galicia into communion, allowing them to retain their honors and ranks. As a result, they broke away from those who accepted them. Whether the Boetican and Carthaginian bishops were motivated by jealousy, envy, and a desire to quarrel, or whether they opposed the decrees of Toledo to uphold ecclesiastical discipline, I dare not decide. What is certain is that the factions in those provinces grew rapidly, leading to appeals to the apostolic seat by Hilarius the bishop, and Elpidius the priest. This resulted in violated peace, confused discipline, and many actions contrary to the canons. They disregarded the order of the fathers and ignored the rules, taking control of churches, which disrupted the priestly harmony foundational to the stability of our Catholic faith, as if driven by a stubborn and furious spirit. Meanwhile, as these issues spread more widely each day, Pope Anastasius passed away. In an effort to address these issues, Hilarius and Elpidius traveled to Rome, where Pope Innocent was leading the apostolic seat. However, the exact year of their arrival in the city could not be determined from any Christian or civil records. This is mainly because the letter that St. Innocent wrote to the Synod of Toledo to resolve the churches of Spain's troubled state does not include any temporal or consular date. It seems likely that several years passed between the noted Council of Toledo and the time of this letter from Pope Innocent I. During this period, the schism, which initially began in the provinces of Boetica and Carthaginensis, could have easily spread throughout all parts of Spain. This idea is supported by the death of Petrunus, the bishop of Emerita, who presided over the Council of Toledo, and the appointment and ordination of his successor, Gregory. Furthermore, Gregory suffered significant injuries after taking the seat of Emerita, and Pope Innocent worked to defend his honor, ensuring that no spirit of faction would arise against anyone of good character following these events. The words with which Pope Innocent begins his letter clearly indicate that he did not address this serious schism at the start of his pontificate. He writes, "Often I was held with excessive care and concern over the dissension and schism of the churches, which the news reports, spreading more widely through Spain each day and advancing at a faster pace." After frequently hearing rumors of such significant issues, he delayed taking action until Hilarius and Elpidius, who had already traveled to Rome from distant parts of Spain, reported with faithful narration, sorrow, and lament about what was happening with the presbyteries' acts, which were troubling the church. At that point, it became clear that action could no longer be delayed, and appropriate remedies had to be provided, as Innocent himself admitted. Therefore, he decided to write to the bishops of the Council of Toledo, to gently correct, admonish, and criticize those who, due to communion with Galatians with Symphesius and Dictinius, had deviated from the peace of all. There is not enough consensus among writers about which Council of Toledo St. Innocent directed his letters to. Baronius and others believe that the Holy Pontiff wrote to the preceding noted council, or at least to the surviving bishops who had attended it. However, Severinus Binius and some other writers suggest that these letters should be attributed to a new council held in Toledo, based on various conjectures supported by Vivarius. He claims that 5 Toledo councils occurred in a short time. But since the decision on this matter is highly complex and lacks the necessary records to resolve or prevent issues, we won't make any definitive statements. Therefore, we'll turn our attention to where St. Innocent addressed the bishops of Toledo. No one can deny that his words were filled with apostolic vigor, primarily aimed at completely extinguishing the fire of contention. He criticized the authors of the schism, who, by pursuing their own desires, created ongoing harm and animosity. It's indeed preferable for any good person to be defeated in such matters rather than achieve a wicked goal they once pursued with bad intentions. To further criticize the authors of the dissensions, St. Innocent compares their erratic and frenzied actions to the Luciferian schism, noting that stubbornness pulled that bishop away from the unity of those who had wisely condemned the Arian heresy through conversion. He asserts that those who refused to communicate with the converted Priscillianists were driven by the same zeal, even though the Church, by its authority, had accepted their confession, approved their repentance and conversion, and welcomed them back into its fold. He adds that this beneficial act displeased some, particularly the Boeotian and Carthaginian bishops. But knowing that the praised bishops were being torn apart by envy, since the Church had received Symphosium, Dictinius, and others with honors and responsibilities, he first praises their commitment to unity and concord, which led them to condemn their wicked heresy, and then expresses surprise that some were displeased with the rightful correction. I ask. A little later, he adds, why were Symphosium, Dictinius, and others who condemned the detestable heresy allowed back into the Catholic faith at that time? Did they lose any of their honors? If this troubles or provokes some, let them read that the Apostle Peter, after his tears, was restored to his former status, and consider that Thomas, after his doubt, lost none of his previous merits. Therefore, he used these and other similar examples from the Holy Scriptures against the authors of the schism. He did this either to defend the previous statutes of the Fathers of Toledo or to clear any suspicion of heresy from Symphosium and Dictinius, or finally, to unite everyone in harmony, resolving all disagreements. His goal was to create one unified and invincible body in the churches of Spain. Thus, he addressed everyone collectively as if writing to each individually. Then, turning his attention to specific scandals, he orders Bishop Rufinus to be reprimanded, who, after being accepted among the penitents at the Synod of Toledo, later usurped the rights of his metropolitan. Despite the people's wishes and the rule of discipline, he dared to ordain a bishop in secret locations, causing scandals in the churches. He then orders the issue of the bishops of Tarraconensis to be addressed, as they complained that Manicius had been ordained as bishop in the Church of Gerunda. But since Rufinus and Manicius of Gerunda had, to the great detriment of the metropolitans, claimed the right of ordination in other churches, according to the Nicene canons, he says, a judgment must be made about such usurpation. After thorough discussion about those ordained, he decrees that they should be stripped of the priesthood, so they understand that what was obtained through a flawed beginning cannot be maintained. In the 3rd chapter, Bishop John faces criticism for his inconsistency. Although he was absent from the council, he still approved the acts of the Council of Toledo through his vicar. The corrections made by Symphasius and Dictinius, who returned from the synod, were so convincing to him that he resumed communication with them. However, over time, he withdrew and agreed to an open schism. As a result, he calls for a thorough investigation into him and others who seem to have withdrawn from the fellowship of communion. If they refuse to return to harmony, they are to be excommunicated. Furthermore, he stresses the importance of addressing the illicit ordinations of clerics, where ecclesiastical discipline seemed to have either collapsed or been completely abolished. To prevent greater disturbances, he does not revoke these ordinations, as they have already been made and due to the number needing correction, but leaves them to God's judgment. However, he highlights the shortcomings of the foreordained with these words. How many of those who, after receiving the grace of baptism, engaged in public affairs and pursued persistent ambition have been admitted to the priesthood? Rufinus and Gregory are said to be among them. How many from military service, who necessarily executed strict orders while obeying authorities? How many from the city council, who, while obeying authorities, did what was commanded of them? How many who celebrated pleasures and public entertainments have reached the honor of the highest priesthood, when none of them should have even reached the fellowship of the clerical order? Pope Innocent could have addressed all these individuals hindered by the faults of irregularity, or at least ordered a full investigation and a new council to be reported to the Apostolic See, but the Holy Pontiff showed leniency, granting pardon and remission to the offenders. It was deemed necessary to maintain the strict discipline of sacred orders in the future. If anyone tries to go against the canons, the ecclesiastical order, or the priesthood itself, they, along with their supporters, should be stripped of any rank and honor they hold. To ensure the Nicene canons are respected and not misinterpreted, it states that those who have been baptized and served in the military, practice law, or are from the curial class, cannot enter the ecclesiastical order if they were crowned, held priesthood, or participated in public games after baptism. However, those baptized young and joined the office of the elect should be appointed to sacred ministries. For those who are older when baptized, they should immediately dedicate themselves to ecclesiastical orders. Regarding those married twice, they are permanently excluded from sacred orders based on the Apostle's words in 1 Timothy chapter 3, the husband of one wife. It dismisses the argument that a wife taken before baptism should not count, as all sins are forgiven in baptism. It clarifies that only sins are forgiven in baptism, not the number of wives. The authors of this mistaken belief are criticized with many arguments, the last being, if a wife taken before baptism isn't counted, then children born from her shouldn't be counted either. How absurd and unreasonable this is, your wisdom will better judge. This, then, is the approach of Pope Innocent, which aligns closely with the decrees and principles of Siricius and other predecessors. It clearly demonstrates the type of apostolic authority the Seat of St. Peter has always exercised in condemning and excommunicating heretics from other churches within the Catholic world. This encompasses matters of receiving penitence and easing canonical penalties through indulgence. It also involves the necessity for new statutes issued by synods to gain authority. The old and proven canons were to be correctly and faithfully interpreted, while false assertions, along with errors in matters of faith, morals, and discipline, were to be rejected. Didn't Pope Innocent achieve all this with just one letter, without anyone daring to appeal to another judgment? Were not Bishop Hilarius and Priest Elpidius sent to Rome for these very serious matters to consult only with Innocent, and wasn't it for the same pontiff to express a definitive sentence in writing? Those who think that the Roman pontiffs acted merely as counselors and teachers, not judges, in these and similar cases, reason too foolishly, if not absurdly. All Catholics, even those who flourished in the early centuries of the Church, never opposed the oracles of the Roman pontiffs but sought and accepted their decrees as rules of faith and morals with the utmost reverence. Meanwhile, it is more grievous to lament that those statutes of Innocent could not be easily and perfectly executed, for although the exact time when the Apostolic Seat issued them is unknown, it is beyond doubt that they were sent to the bishops of Spain when the barbarian invasions were already threatening.
Chapter 12.
As the Alans, Vandals, and Suevi ravaged Gaul and Spain extensively, the Catholic religion was thrown into chaos. The decrees from the Council of Toledo, Pope Innocent I, and other Catholic bishops against the Priscillian heresy could not gain strength or power. This was because the sudden changes in civil affairs allowed barbarian tribes to raid and plunder the provinces of Gaul and Spain. In 409, Gaul and Spain faced countless disasters when the Alans, Vandals, and Suevi, after plundering Gaul, crossed the Pyrenees and occupied Spain. Idatius is the author in the Chronicle. Moreover, Petavius described how that kingdom was divided into various provinces and endured the tyranny of different barbarians in that same year of Christ with these words: the Vandals and Suevi invaded Galatia, the Alans invaded Lusitania and the Carthaginian province, and the Silingi, another group of Vandals, invaded Betaca. Amidst such great calamities and disturbances, it was utterly impossible for Catholic bishops to gather in one assembly. They couldn't reclaim the rights of metropolitans, punish the sacrilegious, remove those unlawfully ordained from sacred ministries, or fulfill the other tasks commanded by Pope Innocent I. This was necessary both for abolishing schism and for overthrowing the Priscillian heretics. Records clearly show that, beyond plundering and destroying cities, these barbarians attempted to completely eradicate the Catholic religion. They destroyed churches, priests, and the relics of holy martyrs, and persecuted all the clergy to the point of death. To start, if we set aside the initial acts of the Council of Braga, where scholars noted possible falsifications, it's clear that during that period, temples were destroyed by the barbarians, servants of Christ were killed by the sword, and the memorials of saints, including bones, tombs, and cemeteries, were desecrated. The power of the empire was shattered, and everything was thrown into chaos, like chaff before the wind. Thus, Pancratian, or Pancratius, who might have been the leader of that pseudo-synod and the bishop of the Church of Braga, is said to have begun his preface this way. If the creation of these acts was fictional, it shouldn't be attributed to the events in Spain caused by the barbarians at that time but rather to the claimed primacy of the seat of Braga over the bishops of Galicia and Lusitania. The Metropolitan of Braga couldn't claim this primacy for himself in the year 411 or 415, as Antonius Pagius noted more clearly in the year of Christ 411. Furthermore, these severe misfortunes that afflicted Spain during that era are described by Orosius, a Spaniard well informed about his homeland's affairs, as well as by Cassiodorus and Prosper in their chronicles, during the 8th consulship of Honorius and the 3rd of Theodosius, which Roman consular records indicate occurred in the year 409 of Christ. Augustine also depicted the dire state of those churches in letter 249, formerly 180, now 228 in the latest edition of the Fathers of St. Maurice, addressed to Honoratus, chapter 5, saying, "For there is no one who would say that ministers should remain where there are no longer those to whom it is necessary to minister." Thus, indeed, the holy bishops fled from Spain, along with the people who had partly fled, partly been killed, partly succumbed to siege, and partly scattered by captivity. Salvian of Marseille claims that this great destruction provided an opportunity for the vile lusts of the Spanish flesh. The shameful and unchecked immoralities of all lusts, in gatherings of both men and women, were mainly spread among the Aquitanians and Spaniards through the efforts and teachings of the Priscillianists. Not only did Salvianus, then the Bishop of Marseille, describe these in 8 books, but Prosper of Aquitaine also expressed his sorrow in a very sad and mournful poem. He describes both the duration of the disaster and the fury of the barbarians, stating that it lasted 10 years, with the Vandals ravaging those once thriving regions so intensely that even harsh and difficult places were led to ruin. Alas, for 10 years, we were struck down by Vandal and Gothic swords. Neither castles on rocks, nor towns on high mountains, nor cities by rivers could withstand the deceit and weapons of the barbaric fury. We all endured the utmost suffering. As for how that barbaric incursion and invasion happened, it's well understood by all learned people. Everyone knows they were first welcomed by the Aquitanians, allied with Attalus as friends and helpers, but suddenly, after rejecting Attalus, they became instruments of divine vengeance, turning entirely to plunder and arson, as even the consul Paulinus recounted in his Eucharistic poem. Indeed, this Paulinus, born from the noble consul family of Ausonia, explains 2 things about himself, the latter of which seems oddly relevant to our situation. He admits to having disagreed with Attalus from the start, who had appointed him as the overseer of distributions, knowing that this role couldn't possibly function sensibly. At that time, Paulinus, having rejected the party of the tyrant Attalus, aligned himself with the Gothic faction. However, the second and more troubling issue, which was handled incorrectly, was met with deep regret. Baronius notes this was because a Christian had turned to disapprove teachings of faith. Paulinus's adherence to these erroneous teachings for 15 years is clearly illustrated by the following verses, where he describes his return to the Catholic communion. After the 5th 3-year period had passed, with Easter's appointed time properly returning, I returned to your holy altars, Christ God, and, by your mercy, joyfully received your sacraments. Baronius questions which heretical beliefs ensnared Paulinus for so long and suggests it was likely the corrupt errors of the Priscillianists. Indeed, based on the accounts of Severus Sulpicius and others, we know that in that region, even the most distinguished individuals were led astray by Priscillian and his followers as they journeyed to Rome. They faced divine retribution, as neither sacred, ecclesiastical, nor civil laws had the power to eradicate the shamelessness of that heresy. Even the emperors of the Christian world, in their efforts to uphold the Catholic faith, enacted various laws against the Priscillianist heresy shortly before the Vandals, Goths, Alans, and other barbarians invaded Gaul and Spain. Honorius Augustus passed a law in the West, instructing the Praetorian prefect Senatori to investigate the Manichaeans and Phrygians, or Priscillianists, and to curb them with various punishments. To address the issue in the East, Emperor Theodosius Augustus took action by issuing 2 rescripts to the Praetorian prefect Antherius, decreeing all punishments except death for the Montanists, Priscillianists, and Eunomians. But what happened then? The Roman Empire in these regions was utterly destroyed due to the negligence, wickedness, greed, or misguided beliefs of its officials. They failed to uphold the laws, resulting in divine retribution. The people themselves lost their property, freedom, and even their lives, suffering the consequences for their heresy and shamelessness. As a result, when the civil and church affairs of the kingdoms of Spain and Galicia were disrupted by numerous and significant disturbances, the decrees of Innocent could not be enforced. This was particularly due to the fact that the people of Spain and Galicia were compelled to obey not one, but 2 rulers influenced by Arianism. In Spain, Ataulfus was the first of the Goths to rule in 414 AD. However, after just a year in power, he was killed by a fellow Goth, and Sagaricus succeeded him, only to be killed himself after 6 months. Following them, 14 other Arian kings from the same lineage ruled until 568. In Galicia and Lusitania, rulers from the Suabi lineage reigned, starting with Hermeric. After 32 years of rule, he died in 440, and was succeeded by Rucilla. After just 7 years in power, he passed the kingdom to Requiario, who, being instructed in the Catholic faith, allowed church matters to be managed smoothly by the holy bishops.
Chapter 13.
We delve into Turribius, the bishop of Astorga, his consultations with the Apostolic See, and his determined efforts to completely eradicate the Priscillian heresy and restore church discipline. As the year 446 or 447 AD unfolded, Turribius, bishop of the Church of Astorga in Galicia, took advantage of a period of relative peace to intensify his mission to cleanse the region of the Priscillian plague. He aimed to ban dictinius books and other apocryphal writings, whether they were kept in private homes or read openly in churches. His goal was to proscribe, destroy, or completely consume them by fire. Following the example of other Catholic fathers, he quickly decided that the only judge and teacher to consult was the Holy Pope Leo of Rome, to whom he sent his writings. Turribius entrusted a deacon from his Astorga church, named Provincio, to travel to Rome and deliver these writings to Pope Leo. Pope Leo, in his 15th letter, noted that from the content of the letter, the series of memoranda, and the text of the booklet, he learned that the foul source of the Priscillianists had resurfaced in those regions. Unfortunately, Turribius' writings, which would have given us a clearer understanding of the troubled state of the churches of Galicia and Spain, have long been lost. Although this is a significant loss, we can somewhat compensate with the letters to bishops Idatius and Sponius, circulated under the name of Turribius of Astorga, and the genuine and well-known letter Leo wrote back to Turribius on this matter. Therefore, it is essential for us to focus on these sources to complete the history of the Priscillianists, which we aim to illuminate. The situation of those churches was indeed lamentable, as Turribius himself, or whoever was portraying him, described in that letter. This was particularly evident when discussing the difficult and unpleasant journeys he often undertook amid hardships and sorrowful necessities. He claimed to have gained some benefit during this time, as we grow in understanding by visiting unknown places and learning about them. Often, we come to realize that things we once thought were the best are actually wrong and most terrible. Furthermore, while traveling, Turribius became better informed and recognized that what once seemed the best to him had become the worst. He immediately revealed this by greatly praising the unity he found in all the churches of the provinces he traveled through. In these places, everyone communicated with each other in complete harmony and without any schism. Having condemned all sects of errors, he said he discovered that one and the same sense of the Catholic faith was held. This faith came from the purest source of truth, not divided into diverse streams that dissolve the plains into muddy abysses, which would hinder the right path of faith. Through this narration, he intended to remind those bishops of nothing else but the zeal for promoting this Catholic unity and communion. For this reason, the deadly virus of the Priscillian heresy had long been expelled and banished from the churches of Spain and Galicia. To inspire Idatius and Sponius towards the zeal of religion, he presented the examples of the churches he visited. The pastors of these churches either reformed those infected by the virus of wicked doctrines back to the embrace of a loving parent if corrected, or expelled the obstinate, like stillborn offspring and not legitimate children, from the fellowship of the holy inheritance. After many long years, Turribius returned to Asturica, deeply troubled when he noticed that traditions long ago condemned by the Church, which he thought had been completely abolished in those regions, were still stubbornly flourishing. Indeed, his torment grew as he realized that, due to the zeal and misguided intentions of many, false teachings were spreading like the heads of a many-headed serpent. Some were reinforcing the old errors of heresies with blasphemous arguments, others were fully embracing the teachings of Priscillian, and yet others, while renouncing the main doctrines clearly opposed to Catholic truth, seemed to hold on to the rest. I say all these issues were growing more freely throughout Spain and Galicia because the gatherings and decrees of synods had ceased, as Turribius himself noted. He lamented the most serious and impious crime, worse than all others. People with different beliefs were coming together at one altar. When Turribius recounted these things, he was motivated solely by love for his homeland, not out of reckless presumption, from which he was entirely free. Earnestly pursuing Catholic truth, he compared local heretics to thieves and adulterers who, by distorting sacred doctrines, rejected the authority of the divine word. To corrupt it more easily with their deceit, they turned away from canonical and gospel scriptures, focusing only on reading apocryphal books. To avoid seeming burdensome or annoying to the bishops he was writing to, or appearing to exercise authority over them, he offered no authoritative exhortation, only instructive suggestions, guided by both prudence and zeal. He considered himself guilty of a more serious crime before God if he remained silent. This was Turribius's approach to his fellow bishops and his effort to uncover the deceit of heretical people. If any Catholics criticized their teachings and leadership more firmly, these heretical individuals would quickly avoid debates, deny their positions, and try to conceal deceit with more deceit. To counteract this, he exposed and revealed their cunning and deceitful tactics. They either preferred apocryphal scriptures over canonical books or revered secret traditions not found in any books, not even apocryphal ones, falsely claiming that the holy apostles spoke through them. Perhaps they secretly kept other books among themselves, revealed only to those they considered perfect. Regarding the apocryphal books the Priscillianists particularly used, he mentioned specifically the Acts circulated under the name of St. Thomas. He pointed out something particularly noteworthy and detestable. It claimed he did not baptize with water, as the Lord's teaching holds, but with oil. This erroneous practice was also followed by the Manichaeans with their leader, Manes. Therefore, this group, detestable to all and condemned worldwide, either accepted only apocryphal books or used other tales filled with apocryphal stories, as revealed through their confession. The Priscillianists handled other similar books, such as the Acts called those of St. Andrew, or others attributed to St. John, which Lucius had once written with sacrilegious words. Finally, there was that volume, a monstrosity of all blasphemies, wrongly titled The Memory of the Apostles. In it, false apostles and prophets falsely claimed the doctrine of the Lord to lend authority to their perversity, destroying the entire law of the Old Testament and everything divinely revealed to St. Moses about the various natures of creation and the Creator. So, when Turribius saw that Galicia and the rest of Spain were plagued by numerous severe challenges and sacrilegious errors, he motivated other holy bishops to seek and apply solutions aligned with divine and ecclesiastical laws. To facilitate this, he authored a work where he compiled blasphemous statements found in the writings of the Priscillianists and responded to them as best he could. We believe his first step was to distribute this work publicly to ensure, as he stated, that no one could claim ignorance or say they possessed these books or read them unknowingly. Afterward, he submitted it for judgment, review, and evaluation by Idatius and Sponius, so they, along with other associated brothers, could thoroughly examine everything and eliminate anything clearly contrary to truth and faith. Additionally, a learned man named Stephanus Belusius approached us, questioning the credibility and authority of Turribius's letter. His observations regarding the Council of Asturica, held in the year 446, led him to suspect forgery. He admitted that his suspicion of fabrication stemmed from the words of St. Leo. The Supreme Pontiff, in his reply to Turribius of Asturica, instructed that at least the bishops of Galicia be convened, with our brothers Idatius and Sponius overseeing their assembly. Observing this, Belusius noted, a serious suspicion arose that Leo's letter inspired an impostor to forge the one claimed to be from Turribius to Idatius and Sponius. Thus, I distanced myself from it. However, in contrast to Belusius, the learned Cardinal de Aguirre argued that the letter praised by Turribius of Astorga should indeed be attributed to him. To counter the objections raised by that knowledgeable collector of councils, he first excused him, acknowledging the numerous fables found in ancient pseudo-chronicles, which often lead to rejection unless they are supported by certain and solid evidence. Secondly, he claimed that the letter of Turribius we are discussing wasn't invented by those old tricksters who filled Spanish history with tales and absurdities, but is actually found in a manuscript about 600 years old, etc. Between these two opposing views, I was initially uncertain. The age of the Codex, which Cardinal Aguirre highly valued, doesn't completely dismiss the suspicion that the praise letter might have been concocted by an ancient impostor. The fact that King Philip II, during Ambrosio Morales' time, moved that codex from the very ancient library of the notable monastery of Saint Emilian to the newer one of Saint Lawrence in El Escorial, about 20 years before the fabrications of Dexter, Maximus, and Julian, doesn't prove anything conclusively. Couldn't older impostors, many centuries ago, have fabricated it? Even after the apostles passed away, many volumes were fabricated by impostors under the guise of sacred scriptures, as clearly revealed by all church records and this letter we discuss. Therefore, the age of that codex proves nothing unless an ancient impostor, well versed in the affairs of Spain and Galicia, had already, in the late 11th century or the early 12th century, fabricated this one letter of Turribius. However, I do not easily agree with Belusius's opinion, but I argue that Cardinal Aguirre's arguments are extremely weak. If I were to discuss the arguments in that letter about assumptions, I must admit that many aspects of its content troubled me, which neither Stephen Belus, nor the collector of the councils of Spain, nor anyone else noted. Take the beginning, for example, where Turribius talks about himself as if returning from a long journey that lasted many years. Who could believe such things about a bishop so dedicated to maintaining church discipline? Would we really think this excellent shepherd, amidst so many pressing calamities and under the displeasure of God and the church, would want or be able to abandon his flock? I find it hard to believe such nonsense, especially since St. Leo, whom Turribius informed about the dire state of those churches, praises him highly for always being vigilant and devoted to the pastoral duty of tending to the Lord's flock. If Turribius had traveled solely by choice, the Holy Pope should have criticized and reprimanded him for abandoning the Lord's flock, leaving the sheep entrusted to him at the mercy of wolves. There are only two reasons he could have justly avoided such reproaches: one, if he had been exiled by Arian rulers; the other, if he had not yet been appointed bishop and was on a long journey for many years. But both reasons are doubtful. If the wrath of the Arian rulers had driven him into exile, he would have emphasized the hardships and inconveniences of exile, not of travel. And elsewhere, after the sentence against him was pronounced, another would have already been installed on the Asturian throne, as the Arians themselves commonly did in the 4th century of the Church. Moreover, if Turribius, in this letter to the other two bishops of Galicia, omitted to mention this punishment of exile, which was well known to them, would he also have omitted to mention it in the letter to Leo? Even Leo himself, in his response, wouldn't have pointed to this as an act of fatherly compassion, right? So, what else can be said? Would Idatius, in his chronicle, who documented other bishop-related disasters, have stayed silent about Turribius's exile? And why would all other writers from Spain and Galicia ignore such a significant issue? Therefore, there's no need to consider this as an escape. Turribius couldn't have embarked on such a long journey for several years before becoming a bishop. After Dictinius's death, which happened before 420 AD, as noted by Augustine, Turribius had already joined the Church of Astorga. But at that time, it wasn't Leo the Great but Zosimus or Boniface who led the Catholic Church. So, when Turribius mentions in the 2nd chapter of that letter that he's just returned from a journey, it suggests that the events from the Asturian Council, as described by Belusius and Aguirre from Idatius's chronicle, don't fit into Leo's era, specifically the year 446. If we imagine that Turribius didn't write to Idatius and Sponius right after becoming a bishop, nor did he appeal to Leo as the supreme teacher and judge, but instead allowed 27 or 28 years to pass, he would be criticized for delaying in addressing serious issues and for wanting to travel, leaving his church, against the sacred canons. So, we must admit that the letter contains obscure matters that can't be reconciled with Turribius's piety, church discipline, sacred canons, and Christian affairs. This is what I concluded after reading the letter multiple times. I also found other parts that at least hint at the writer's clear negligence. Indeed, these seem to me like those mentioned in chapter 4, suggesting they shouldn't persist until the end, where the true meaning can't be debated according to grammatical rules, or what's seen in chapter 5, where the same story from the apocryphal Acts of St. Thomas is repeated, along with similar things, either pointing to the writer's carelessness or diminishing the value of the manuscript found under Turribius's name and faithfully uncovered. However, even though many parts of the letter differ greatly from the truth, or at least from plausibility, I hesitate to say it should be rejected or considered spurious. Just as Cannell included it in his edition, I believe it should be preserved in a new edition I've decided to create after these exercises. Therefore, with various annotations from the most reliable writers, I've made sure to enhance it as best as possible, so the reader can avoid the ambiguities and obscure meanings it contains. Meanwhile, before I finish, I think it's important to confirm what's described about the state of the churches of Galicia and Spain. Indeed, they align completely with what's seen in the letter of St. Leo the Great, whose faith and authority would be a crime to doubt. both ancient and old manuscript copies included as the genuine work of the Holy Pontiff, with the Council of Braga and the Fourth General Synod attributing it to St. Leo. All writers, without exception, have testified to this truth, and they provided a wide opportunity for editors to publish it in all circulated copies, with all doubts removed.
Chapter 14. Discussing the letter written by St. Leo the Great to Turribius of Astorga regarding the Priscillianist heresy.
A newly discovered fragment on canonical scriptures, retrieved from the Vatican Palace Library. With so many strong testimonies supporting us, we certainly could not doubt the truth and authority of St. Leo the Great's letter, so we focused on eliminating any errors that might have sneaked in. We had all the necessary support to complete this task successfully. In addition to reviewing various ancient Vatican manuscripts ourselves and the Grimani archetype preserved in Paris readings from which Paschasius Quesnellus claims to have enhanced his edition, we faithfully copied these with the help of friends. We compared the letter to both the Vallicellan and 2 Florentine copies, ensuring that, with divine assistance, Leo's works could emerge purer, clearer, and more complete with updated types. But let's return to our main topic. The celebrated letter from the Holy Pontiff to the Bishop of Astorga contains 16 chapters, as Turribius had presented Leo with that many topics to explore and define. This is evident from the words, "Because, therefore, your love has comprehended the condemned opinions in 16 chapters with as much diligence as possible." However, the very ancient Vatican copy and the Grimani manuscript indicate it should be 17. This is further confirmed by the chapter division itself, which ends with the following title, Chapter 17, Whether the Flesh of Christ Truly Rested in the Tomb. Those who often commend Quesnellus for his effort, labor, or diligence in enhancing or correcting the works of St. Leo, more than is fair, should take note of the oversight he has made. Let them consider whether this serves as evidence that he used the Grimani manuscript as a benchmark in verifying the readings of Leo's texts. Let them say whether they have thoroughly examined the works of the Holy Pontiff, who, in a poorly arranged summary, only includes the titles of 16 chapters, omitting the last one. The letter itself is actually divided into 17 chapters, with the last chapter having its own title, which is completely missing in the previous summary. We will delve deeper into this matter in its appropriate context, just as we will also discuss elsewhere a certain unpublished fragment of this letter on canonical scriptures, sourced from a very ancient Vatican Palatine copy. We will further explore whether this should be attributed to Leo or not, as it seems to primarily relate to the rite and order that the Roman Church of St. Peter used to follow throughout the year in reading the divine and canonical scriptures. So, let us now freely explore the vast field of this Leonine letter, as it appears in all the editions published so far. Since the letter is filled with the most certain and abundant testimonies from various sources, we will more easily uncover both the origins and errors of Priscillian's heresy. At the same time, we will more clearly observe the authority and unchanging judgment of the Apostolic See in refuting them. Indeed, St. Leo taught right at the beginning of that letter that Priscillian's doctrines were worse than the errors of all previous heretics. He described them as drawing every harmful contagion of impiety, calling the sect of the Priscillianists the foulest cesspool of all heresies. He adds that the Priscillianists had sunk so deeply into the darkness of paganism that, by using the vain lies of mathematicians and the profane secrets of magical arts, they placed the faith of religion and the reasoning of morals under the power of demons and the influence of the stars. Leo reviewed these and other similar doctrines of that most wicked sect and recalls the zeal of the ancient fathers who flourished in the previous century, who, in councils, exerted all efforts to drive such impious madness from the whole church. He then recounts how the leaders of the time were so opposed to this sacrilegious madness, particularly Maximus the tyrant, that they used public laws to execute its creator along with many of his followers. This was the first instance and example of such a severe judgment, where the leaders and magistrates of the era sometimes punished stubborn heretics. This could greatly trouble the minds of both ancient and modern writers. Natalis Alexander, in his Ecclesiastical History, 4th century, Chapter 3, Article 17, noted that heretics might misuse this story. This misuse was against the duty of the Holy Inquisition, which hands over obstinate heretics to secular magistrates for severe punishment, and against the rulers and magistrates themselves, who also have the right to inflict the death penalty. In the same place, P. Natalis aims to defend that proposition from any criticism, which had appeared in the previous edition. No Catholic has said that emperors and kings cannot impose the death penalty on a heretic. However, he later explained in the latest edition the context in which he said this, and he works to affirm this power of the leaders of the time. The same authority of the leaders was also addressed by his annotator Constantinus Roncalia in the latest Lucency edition. He first demonstrated through the consensus of the canonists that in judging heretical cases, both legally and factually, the Church possesses authority. He then stated, it is within the leader's authority to eliminate heresies, sacrileges, and similar issues, through laws and penalties, as Bellarmine and others have taught. If both of these distinguished men, and all who have discussed similar cases, had considered our Holy Pontiff, they would not have struggled so much, but would have more easily and effectively countered any objections raised by the heterodox. Why did the leaders of the time order such harsh judgment on the Priscillianists? Pope Leo explains with these words. The leaders believed that all concern for decency was being discarded, marriages were being dissolved, and both divine and human laws were being overturned if people with such beliefs were allowed to live freely. The Priscillianists' actions not only brought disgrace and harm to religion but also threatened to completely disrupt the civil state, especially in matters that violated the laws of nature. Therefore, the leaders decided to eliminate and abolish the practice of that sect along with its founders, using the death penalty. Pope Leo, citing these reasons, acknowledged that such judgments had long supported the Church's leniency. He adds, this strictness has long supported the Church's leniency, which, while content with ecclesiastical judgment, avoids bloody vengeance. Nonetheless, it is backed by the severe decrees of Christian rulers, as those who fear physical punishment sometimes seek spiritual remedies. Therefore, when the Church observes the stubbornness of heretics, it does not establish or inflict capital punishment. It remains content with spiritual penalties and avoids any bloody vengeance to maintain leniency. However, if such punishments are imposed by the public decrees of secular leaders and magistrates, they greatly support and assist the Church, especially because offenders, frightened by the severity of physical punishments, are inclined to seek spiritual remedies like renouncing their crimes and repenting. No one should convince themselves, using reasoning similar to Leo's, to excuse the obstinacy of Idatius and Ithacius, which we discussed earlier. For this reason, they were disliked by Catholic bishops, especially Martin, and Ithacius himself was openly condemned by Bishop Theognostus. A bishop cannot be excused if he focuses on his own interests and ignores the decisions made by his fellow bishops in councils. This is particularly true if he tries to pressure secular rulers and magistrates with his accusations to bring about the death of the guilty. It's clear that such actions go against the gentle nature of the Catholic Church. The leaders of our churches and the sacred office of the Inquisition, which Natalis Alexander warned heretics could target, strongly oppose this. Pope Leo himself confirmed that these severe penalties were beneficial to the Church. He noted that physical punishments and the enforcement of church laws had to stop for many years due to the serious disruptions caused by wars. The priests of the provinces could no longer gather frequently as they used to. The Holy Pope stated, secret treachery found freedom, and instead of correcting, it incited the subversion of many minds. He lamented the dire state of Galicia and Spain, where not only the common people, as he heard from Turribius, were weakened by a deadly plague, but more seriously, the priests themselves were corrupted by it. They suppressed the truth with many errors. They preferred Priscillian's teachings over the gospel documents and eventually preached these distorted teachings to the people. This led to rejecting the revelations of the Holy Spirit and inspiring the doctrines of the devil in the minds of their listeners. Turribius suggested to St. Leo that these issues be addressed to lament the state of those churches. He submitted 17 chapters that briefly contained opinions condemned long ago. The Holy Pope, with the supreme dignity of his apostolate, addressed these anew to ensure none of those blasphemies would seem tolerable or doubtful in the future. Meanwhile, we think it will be agreeable to our readers to briefly and concisely summarize these chapters here. To tackle this task, even though many renowned theologians have already contributed to writing church histories, I'm unsure if they've successfully identified all the major errors of this sect, which have led to other less significant ones. Even Father Natalis Alexander didn't fully succeed in this. He tried to compile a list or summary of all the errors of the Priscillianists, but inexplicably noted only 14, completely omitting 3 others that were quite significant. However, just from this letter of Leo, it becomes evident to everyone that there were actually 17, as we will soon explain. The Holy Pope, therefore, to satisfy the concerns of Bishop Turribius of Astorga, revisits each chapter individually that Deacon Provincus from Galicia had brought for review. First, the Priscillianists held impious beliefs about the mystery of the Trinity, claiming there was only one person in God with 3 names, as taught by Sibelius and the Patripassians. The Holy Pope refuted this error not only with the decrees of the Nicene Council, but also with theological arguments that seemed to echo the phrases of the Athanasian Creed. Second, they fabricated the idea that certain virtues proceed from God, which they claimed he did not always possess in his essence but began to have at some point, as the Arians most wrongly reasoned. Third, they argued that the Son of God is called the only begotten because he alone was born of a virgin. Therefore, they either attributed a beginning from the mother to Christ, like Paul of Samosata and Photinus, or believed there was not one Son of God but others begotten by the Supreme Father, of whom this one was born of a woman and is called the only begotten because none of the other sons of God took on this condition of birth. Fourth, they did not believe that Christ the Lord was born in the true nature of man and therefore, like Cerdo, Marcion, and Manichaeus, claimed he merely assumed a phantom and illusory flesh. Misled by this error, they spent Christmas and Easter in sorrow and mourning, fasting and afflicting their bodies. Fifth, they believed that a person's soul is of divine substance and does not differ in nature from its creator. Sixth, they claimed the devil was never good, and that his nature was not the work of God, but that he emerged from darkness and chaos without a creator, being the source and essence of all evil. Seventh, they, like the Manichaeans, condemned marriage and weddings to scorn the creation of legitimate offspring and more readily embrace the freedom of all immoralities. An eighth error related to this was the belief that human bodies are creations of the devil, with seeds of conception forming in the wombs of women. They claimed these bodies, crafted by diabolic power, are unworthy of the soul's dignity. Consequently, they denied that once the body is dissolved, it could or should be revived through the mystery of resurrection. The ninth belief was equally monstrous, asserting that the children of the promise are conceived not from the seed of the flesh but from the Holy Spirit, and are not subject to sin or mortal contamination passed down from Adam, the first parent. Tenth, they taught that souls, once free from any bodily burden, sinned in the heavens and, due to this, fell from higher places to lower ones. They encountered different rulers and were enclosed in bodies of varying severity or gentleness, depending on their destiny and condition. Thus, whatever happens in this life in varied and unequal ways seems to occur due to preceding causes. Their 11th blasphemy was the belief that both the souls and bodies of humans are bound by the stars of destiny. Consequently, like pagans, they either worshipped stars favorable to them or sought to appease those that were adverse. In the 12th section, they talked about different aspects of the soul and body, assigning various powers to each. They linked the virtues, which they believed guided the soul, to the names of patriarchs. Opposing these, they matched bodily signs that they believed influenced the body through virtue. They claimed that parts of the human body corresponded with the 12 zodiac signs, arranging them by placing Aries at the head, Taurus at the neck, Gemini at the shoulders, Cancer at the chest, and so on. In the 13th section, they made mistakes in understanding the scriptures, associating the canonical texts with the names of patriarchs. They falsely suggested that these names indicated 12 virtues necessary for inner transformation. In the 14th section, they claimed that humans were influenced by stars and signs, suggesting that many elements found in sacred texts related to the outer person. They implied a conflict within those scriptures between divine and earthly nature, with different authorities for the soul and body. In the 15th section, they introduced false writings they called canonical, altering the true scriptures. To combat this serious issue, the Holy Pope established a general law, instructing priests to ensure that falsified texts were not read and apocryphal writings were not kept. He stated, "Apocryphal writings, falsely attributed to apostles and containing falsehoods, must not only be banned but completely destroyed by fire." Consequently, heretics or innovators have no defense, as they criticize recent Roman popes for banning and burning their works. The practice in the Catholic Church is very old, and it shouldn't just be traced back to Pope Gelasius or the Council of 70 bishops from that time. It also dates back to Leo the Great, who stressed its importance for all Catholic bishops to follow. Therefore, among others, Van Espen and Bozeber, who are not Catholic, are clearly mistaken, as Leo's approach reveals and proves. When Van Espen, in the first part of his works titled On Universal Church Law, overlooked Leo's decree and started discussing the Church's discipline on banning heretical books, he relied solely on the Gelasian decree. He attempted to diminish its impact by suggesting from the pulpit that the Church only meant to prevent public, not private, reading of banned books. Indeed, Van Espen is greatly mistaken. To clarify this, there's no need to diverge from our focus and discuss the Gelasian decree now. That decree has been published with many scholarly notes, thanks to the efforts of Chief Lucius Holstenius and Father Joseph Bianchini, making further commentary unnecessary. To address Van Espen's error, it's enough to note what St. Leo included. He prohibited not only the public use of corrupt, apocryphal, and false books by Catholics but also the private reading or possession of these books at home. He instructed that bishops who allowed this would be marked as heretics. He added, "Therefore, if any bishop does not prohibit the keeping of apocryphal books at home or allows them to be read in the Church as canonical books, corrupted by Priscillian's correction, he should know he will be judged as a heretic, because anyone who does not turn others away from error shows himself to be in error." An ancient Palatine Vatican manuscript provides us with a famous fragment of this letter following these words, which hasn't been annotated or published by previous editors of St. Leo's works. While this text might not perfectly match Leo's speech style, the age and authority of the respected manuscript, along with how well the argument fits with the previous statements by the Holy Pope, have led us to decide to include it in the second volume, enclosed in lines. As for the manuscript's antiquity, experts in ancient writings have concluded with us that it dates back to the 9th century. The argument's reasoning clearly aligns with St. Leo's writing purpose. After dismissing the apocryphal scriptures, he felt it was important to identify the canonical ones and establish the order in which they should be read in the Church, ensuring complete harmony among the ministers of the sacred altar in singing divine praises and celebrating mysteries. Moreover, adding this fragment connects the earlier parts nicely to the later ones. And in the manuscript, we find this heading: "Here begins the judgment of Pope Leo on the apocryphal scriptures." It starts with these words from the notable chapter 15 of his letter to Turribius: "Therefore, it must be ensured and especially taken care of with priestly diligence that corrupted manuscripts, etc., up to those, which in all editions close this chapter, namely, for he who does not correct others from error shows himself to be in error." Following this, these additional words are immediately included: "All the divine scriptures of the Holy Canon are read from the beginning of the year to the end in the Church of St. Peter in this order. During springtime, that is, 7 days before the beginning of Lent until the 8th day before Easter, the books of Moses are read with Joshua and Judges, etc." Thus, I will take a moment to briefly note and annotate two things here. First, the order described in this fragment for reading all the scriptures of the Holy Canon throughout the year aligns with the distribution and arrangement also seen in the current Roman breviary. This demonstrates the authority and ancient origins of this sacred ritual. Our ancestors, with their wisdom, designated scripture readings that align more harmoniously with the divine mysteries celebrated in the Church during each of the 4 seasons. This approach was intended to enhance the dignity of the mysteries and to educate the people. Another point is that the praised fragment includes nearly all the books listed in the Canon of the Council of Trent, Session 4, with just 1 or 2 exceptions. These aspects offer a rich field for scholarly exploration for those dedicated to studying sacred liturgies, who rightly commit their efforts to the valuable study of ancient sacred matters. We do not include the entire text here to avoid deviating too far from our main objective. However, we will present it as it appears in the manuscript, which is publicly available, in the other volume of all the works of St. Leo the Pope, and we will add brief notes for clarity. Returning to our main topic, let's reason as follows. By the 5th century, due to the strictness of canonical discipline, no one was permitted to keep corrupted scriptures from heretics in their homes. So, how is it that now the heterodox express such discontent when they realize that the reading of their books is forbidden to Catholics by the Apostolic Seat under threat of anathema? But I would be remiss to dwell too long on this well-trodden subject, so let's move on to the 16th chapter, where the Holy Pope discusses other books written by heretics. This 16th chapter is noted by St. Leo the Great, meaning that the booklet of Turribius sent to the Apostolic Seat contains 16 chapters for discussion. The Bishop of Astorga had added a note at the end of his letter about the flesh of Christ. Did he truly rest in the tomb? Because of this, we decided that the ancient widespread reading, specifically, the 16th, should be removed. Supported by the manuscripts, as we mentioned, the new reading, numbered 17, should be adopted. In discussing the 16th chapter of Turribius's book, the Holy Pope first agrees with Turribius's complaint, particularly regarding the writings and discussions of Dictinius, one of his predecessors in the See of Astorga. Dictinius had written those books while influenced by the Priscillianist doctrine, as confirmed by the Acts of the Council of Toledo, Augustine, and other contemporary writers, as well as by St. Leo himself. Many people read these books with reverence, but they should have valued his corrections more than his errors. The Holy Pope states that they are not reading Dictinius, but Priscillian, and they mistakenly approve of his errors rather than his corrections. Therefore, he declares that those who use these writings are outside the ecclesiastical community. The Supreme Pontiff did not exclude anyone directly, but to include people of all orders and statuses, he proclaims from the seat of St. Peter the Apostle, "Let no one presume this will go unpunished, nor be considered among the Catholics, if they use writings condemned not only by the Catholic Church but also by their author." After this, St. Leo highlights the cunning of the Priscillianists and Manichaeans, who cleverly avoided the severity of imperial laws. Although the members of these sects had the same beliefs and professed the same sacrileges, they were known by different names. Even though the Priscillianists pretended to accept the Old Testament, which was rejected by the Manichaean offspring, the Holy Pope notes that both groups aimed for the same outcome, what the latter attacked by rejecting, the Priscillianists corrupted by accepting. Throughout this history series, it's been demonstrated that the Priscillianists aligned with the Manichaeans in their detestable mysteries, obscenities, and shameful acts. Leo Turbius highlights this by referring to the thorough investigation held in Rome against the Manichaeans, from which he sent copies of the judgment and records to the Bishop of Astorga. Moving to the final section, as we've mentioned, Turbius asked Leo to define in his letter whether Christ's body truly lay in the tomb. This mystery had puzzled several Catholics because Christ had descended to the underworld. People in Spain struggled to understand how these two concepts, the descent to the underworld and the resting of Christ's body in the tomb, could coexist accurately. The Holy Pontiff uses various scriptural testimonies to show that these two doctrines of the Apostles' Creed are not contradictory. He clarifies that the opposing view comes from the teachings of Priscillian and Mani, who falsely claim to confess Christ while denying the truth of the Incarnation, death, and resurrection. Thus, it's clear that in reviewing these chapters, St. Leo acted as both supreme judge and teacher. The Holy Pontiff makes it evident that the nonsense of the adversaries has no place here. To ensure his teachings and canonical judgments are known to all clergy and faithful, he first orders encyclicals to be sent among the bishops to arrange a suitable place for a council. Then, he instructs the priests from neighboring provinces to gather for a thorough examination to determine if any bishops might be tainted by the Priscillianist heresy. Those whom the council found deeply tainted were, according to the papal decrees, to be separated from the Catholic communion if they refused to condemn the most wicked sect that perverted all senses. To ensure these matters, which pertain to the rights of the Apostolic See, were carried out more fully and easily, the Holy Pontiff did not rely solely on this letter. He promptly sent additional letters to the co-bishops of Tarragona, Carthage, Lusitania, and Galicia, calling for a general council. In doing so, he exercised the supreme right of his pontificate. This is clearly demonstrated by Leo's words: "It will be your duty, beloved, to ensure that our decree's authority is conveyed to the bishops of the aforementioned provinces." Whether Leo wrote only one encyclical or several letters to compel all the praised bishops of Spain and Galicia to attend the council, I cannot say, as these documents have not resurfaced and may have been lost to time. If I could ask the critics of the Roman See's rights why the great Turbius, amidst his greatest troubles, directed his inquiries to the Apostolic See and not to the bishop of another see, what would Leonoius, Blondellus, Quesnellus, and others say? Would they argue that the entire matter was postponed to a future council? They would be mistaken and deceiving themselves. The highest priest, following in the footsteps of his predecessors from the Vatican throne, not only rejected the errors of the Priscillianists with theological reasoning but also condemned them with an anathema. He banned the private and public reading of apocryphal scriptures and heretical books and ordered them to be burned, declaring that bishops outside of Catholic communion who did not obey these statutes were to be considered separate. What then? Did he leave these matters to be defined by a future council? Would it have been allowed for the fathers of the council to easily deviate from these rules and statutes? It would be nonsensical to claim that, as those who pursue the truth understand that the examination was only referred to the fathers of the council to see if any bishops were contaminated by this heresy. According to these consultations and responses to Turbius, they were undoubtedly to be separated from communion. For as the Holy Pontiff says, they use the Catholic name in vain if they do not resist these impieties. Therefore, it was not necessary for that council to condemn a heresy that the most reverend fathers and Leo himself had already condemned, but to punish the heretics whose cases had not yet been sufficiently examined by the Apostolic See. Therefore, our Leo, having already sufficiently discussed the matters pertaining to law, subjected those that could pertain to persons and facts to the judgment of a general, or at least provincial, council. Indeed, because the entire focus of the pontiff was on healing the evils of Galicia and preventing the Catholic religion from being completely destroyed by spreading more widely in those regions, he decided to apply the following plan. If anything prevented the holding of a general council, he ordered at least the priests of Galicia to come together, entrusting the responsibility of convening them to Idatius and Sponius, as they were distinguished by metropolitan authority, and added the concern of Turbius to them, so that a remedy could be brought to such great wounds more quickly, even by a provincial assembly. While these tasks were to be carried out in Galicia and Spain by order of Leo, he entrusted the Pope's letters to Provincius, the deacon of Asturica, to be delivered to the bishops of both kingdoms. During this time, Calapius and Argibert were serving as Roman consuls. The Roman consuls' records show that this took place in the year 447 AD. For those who are deeply interested in theological matters and seek the truth, if they wish to gather more material to refute the errors of this wicked sect, they should consult the homilies of the same Holy Pope. Fairly having uncovered the wickedness and sacrileges of these depraved people, he couldn't hold back his passion and, during sacred ceremonies, openly criticized that profane religion and its doctrines. We have provided enough insight into his approach, so this speech of ours doesn't become unnecessarily long.
Chapter 15.
On the councils held in the kingdoms of Galicia and Spain by the command of St. Leo the Great, the false judgment of Paschasius Quesnel on the ancient code of the canons of the Roman Church. We are now delving into topics that are less clear and much more difficult than what we've already discussed, especially since we lack the resources that could easily guide us in discovering the truth due to the loss of ancient records. Nevertheless, we will not abandon our effort until it becomes clearer how the priests of both kingdoms obeyed the papal commands. The bishops, as we've seen, couldn't come together in one general council due to various civil administrations and differences in lineage, character, and religion of different rulers. So, each kingdom's metropolitan gathered their own synods. The bishops of Tarragon, Carthage, Lusitania, and Bataca, under the rule of Theodoric the Arian, who descended from the Goths, held their council in the year 447. I am convinced that the fact provided by the collectors of the general councils is a well-known testimony of this. After the canons of the First Council of Toledo, a certain rule of faith appears, which bears the following title: Here begins the rule of the Catholic faith against all heresies, and especially against Priscillianists, which the bishops of Tarragon, Carthage, and Bataca made, and sent to Balcanius, bishop of Galicia, with the command of Pope Leo of Rome. They also established the above-mentioned 20 chapters of canons in the Council of Toledo. The final words indicate that the bishops of Spain met at Toledo. However, no one should believe that the preceding chapters, as preserved in today's collection of councils, were published in the time of Leo. For first, Patronus and others subscribed to them, who gathered in the year 400 for the case of Symphacius and Dictinius. Bishop Ortesius of Galicia also signed, and we've already discussed him extensively in previous sections. However, the idea that they could still have been alive in the year 447, or that Ortesius could freely join this council with the bishops of Spain, is completely implausible. It is clearer than daylight that Harduin's annotation should be verified, which states that in the edition of this council curated by Loasia, these words can be read: the end of the Council of Toledo. This indicates that the following rule of faith does not belong to it at all but should be attributed to a council convened by the order of Leo. Indeed, Poggi judged the matter no differently. After thoroughly considering what seems to pertain to ecclesiastical sanctions and the order of records, he asserted that the profession of faith we are discussing was written during the time of Leo. Such truth cannot be hindered by the great diversity of manuscript and edited examples we encounter in these anathemas. While some manuscripts contain only 12 anathemas, the published copies have 18, and in the works of Augustine, this number increases to 26. Observing such great diversity, Quesnellus thought it could benefit his studies in 264 parts. Therefore, he sometimes attributes it to Leo, suspecting it was taken from the Roman Code of Canons, and sometimes conjectures it should be ascribed to Augustine, as if it was once sent to the bishops of Spain or taken from Africa by Leo when he was still a follower of Zosimus, and delivered a decree against the Pelagians, etc. Shall we consider Quesnellus to be reasoning correctly and wisely in this and the following places? Both are frivolous and baseless, as Harduin noted long ago. But those who clearly understand that this editor of the works of Leo of Paris wanted to fabricate and talk nonsense according to custom will see it clearly when they cast their eyes on the profession of faith and those 18 subjunctive anathemas. Who would flatter themselves by thinking that the rule of faith, along with its attached anathemas, was crafted long before the full knowledge of the Priscillianists' errors, their methods, and origins? If we suggest that this profession of faith was added to the Roman canon before the bishops of Tarragona, Carthage, Lusitania, and Bataca met, or before Turbius consulted the apostolic seat and received a response from the Holy Pope, and if it was issued by Augustine or anyone else, could Quesnellus have possibly kept this from Turbius and Leo? It's not reasonable to suspect that. Both must have been well informed about the events in the Church, and especially the Roman Pope would have known if this document had been brought to Rome from Africa, and if it was included in the Roman canon by him or his predecessors. So, why did the Holy Pope never reference this profession of faith? Why didn't he directly oppose the anathemas to the Priscillianist articles mentioned in the profession? And why did Turbius consult the apostolic seat if the bishops of Spain had already long accepted this token of faith from Augustine? Therefore, I believe Quesnellus was completely mistaken in attributing that profession of faith to Augustine. The bishops of Tarragona and others at the council would not have remained silent about his name if they had borrowed from his works, nor would they have failed to mention the canons and statutes of the Roman and apostolic seat if they had taken the rule of faith from that document. Yet, in that inscription, only Leo's name is mentioned. It states, "Here begins the rule of the Catholic faith against all heresies, and especially against the Priscillianists, which the bishops of Tarragona made, and sent with the command of Leo, bishop of the city of Rome, to Balcanius, bishop of Galicia. It's not right to attribute this to a scribe's error or negligence, as the fathers of the Council of Braga did. In the year 563 AD, there was a significant acknowledgement when Lucretius, the bishop and leader of that sacred council, spoke to the other bishops. He referred to the Synod of Toledo, which took place under the reign and directive of Leo. During this synod, they drafted a rule of faith against the Priscillian heresy, along with several chapters, and sent it to Balcanius, who was then the head of the church in Braga. So if the bishops of Tarragona, Carthage, Lusitania, and Baetica composed that profession of faith with its anathemas or chapters in 447 AD, it couldn't have been influenced by Augustine, since he had already passed away in Hippo by 430. Had they drawn from Augustine's works or Roman canons, Lucretius would not have mentioned writing the rule of faith against the Priscillian heresy with some chapters. Instead, he might have said something more familiar, like, the profession of faith was recited, or they read the profession with the chapters from a text, or they had it copied. Those who have thoroughly studied the acts and histories of the councils know well that we're not relying on trivial guesses. But Quesnellus might have realized this if he hadn't been so influenced by his own studies and overlooked reviewing or understanding the acts of the same Council of Braga to which he refers. Didn't Bishop Lucretius, right after the words praised by us and noted by Quesnellus himself, add these other words? Hence, because we have here at hand the written example of the prescribed faith with its chapters for teaching the ignorant, if it pleases your reverence, let it be recited. Then all the bishops agreed, reading these chapters is very necessary. They give no other reason than this, that the ancient statutes of the Holy Fathers, which were long ago rejected by the seat of the most blessed Apostle Peter and condemned as fabrications of the Priscillian heresy, should be known to the simpler ones. But should these matters be considered against Quesnellum, I ask you, reader, should you reflect on it? Indeed, those ancient decrees of the Holy Fathers, which condemned the monstrous Priscillian heresy, are attributed to the apostolic see of the most blessed Peter. Therefore, Augustine cannot be said to be the author of that profession of faith and those chapters, for although he was renowned for his merits, labors, and honors, when did he ever attain the apostolic throne of Peter? Nor does the great diversity in the number of anathemas, often cited by Quesnellum, obscure this truth. Firstly, the manuscript copies from which this diversity was mainly drawn were sometimes corrupted or expanded due to the negligence and carelessness of the scribes. Additionally, for other reasons, the Fathers themselves, referring to preceding church statutes, only presented those parts that seemed relevant to newly raised questions, or they added other parts which they thought more appropriate to the matters they were addressing. So what is surprising if, when examining old writings, we sometimes find the same document to be shortened or expanded? In these matters, which depend on the will of the writers and users, unless their intention is known, it cannot be judged without difficulty, especially when the original copies are missing. However, I believe that not much effort needed to be spent by Quesnellum on this task. The same fathers of the praised Council of Braga had in their hands the genuine code containing the acts of those who attended the Toledo Synod convened in the year 447. Therefore, after reading the example of faith with the accompanying chapters, they deemed it necessary to explain the same chapters more simply and clearly 116 years later, so that those less educated might understand what had been condemned by the apostolic see of St. Peter under the sentence of anathema from the doctrines of Priscillian, as the Braga Fathers say. Reading these chapters is essential to clarify and simplify the difficult parts. This way, even those with less education can understand, and the false teachings of Priscillian's error, condemned long ago under the sentence of anathema, can be clearly rejected. We should be thankful that these fathers revisited the same chapters, as they have provided us with a clear and accessible path to understand the number and nature of the anathemas issued by the fathers from Tarraco, Carthage, Lusitania, and Baetica in the year 447, under the direction of Leo the Great, to completely eradicate the harmful virus of Priscillian's heresy. These anathemas, if we examine them, align entirely with Leo's letter to Turribius. Therefore, it is unreasonable to attribute them solely to Augustine or to claim that they were included in the Roman canonical code before St. Leo. To avoid being suspected of fabrication or falsehood by Quesnell's diligent readers, we need to explain why the Fathers of Bracara revisited the same chapters and wanted to explain them more clearly. They stated that any cleric, monk, or layperson found to still hold or defend such views understand this as with Priscillian should be immediately cut off from the body of the Catholic Church, like a truly rotten limb, to prevent any reproach from being attributed to the Orthodox due to the mixing of such people with the faithful. This judgment was pronounced by Bishop Lucretius and approved by all the Fathers of the Council, as indicated by the following words. The chapters proposed and re-read against Priscillian's heresy contain the following. However, when the 17 anathemas are immediately presented, they perfectly address the consultations of Turribius and align completely with Leo's responses, as is clearly evident upon reading them. Therefore, I believe there's no doubt that the Fathers of Tarragona, along with bishops from the other 3 provinces of Spain, eager to follow Leo's directives, first issued and promulgated the rule of faith and the anathemas we're discussing in the year 447. If Canel denies this, he must claim one of 2 things, either that Turribius's consultations to the apostolic seat were already discussed and settled before Leo's pontificate, or that the letter to Turribius should be attributed to a different Roman pontiff than Leo, both of which are clear fabrications. It's necessary to counter and eliminate the escape route Canel had prepared for himself. Specifically, the one he believed was provided by the heading of that profession of faith, which the collectors of the councils presented as linked to the Council of Toledo I with 18 anathemas. It states, the beginning of the rule of the Catholic faith against all heresies, and especially against the Priscillians, which the bishops of Tarragona, etc. Therefore, if this profession of faith denounces and rejects all heresies, it didn't first appear when those bishops of Spain convened. Instead, it's possible to conclude that the Fathers of Spain adapted it for their own use because they recognized how effectively it opposed the Priscillianists. Indeed, someone might incorrectly suggest that this document is attributed to Augustine, or that it was fabricated by borrowing from the Roman Code of Canons published before Leo. But this would reveal their great ignorance of ecclesiastical history and especially of Leo's works. What did this holy pontiff preach and write concerning the Priscillian heresy? Didn't he write that this heresy was derived from the sources and authors of all previous heresies? He clearly showed in his responses to Turribius that the errors of the Gnostics, Cerdo, Photinus, Apollinaris, Sibelius, the Patripassians, Arius, Mani, and others were accepted and promoted by the Priscillianists. Therefore, if the bishops of Spain wished to adhere to the teachings and letters of Leo, they needed to use these words, against all heresies, and especially against the Priscillianists. For the Holy Pope, in various places but especially at the beginning of his letter to Turribius, discussing this heresy, writes, there is nothing impure in the thoughts of any impious people that is not converged in this doctrine, for they have mixed multiple impurities from all earthly opinions, so that they alone, the Priscillianists, of course, drink fully whatever others have merely tasted. Immediately following these words, he added others that are remarkably relevant to our point. Indeed, if all heresies that arose before the time of Priscillian were carefully reconsidered, hardly any error would be found from which this impiety did not draw contamination. No one should think that the Holy Pope intended to indicate these things only in general. When he addressed the consultations and questions of the same Turribius, he specifically designated the sources and authors from which they derived the errors he refuted in the chapters 267 and 7, or in the 10 and 8, of his letter. The bishops of Spain who gathered at that council, along with the Fathers of Braga, followed this method closely. As we have seen, they revisited the praised chapters of heresies. Regarding the Fathers of Braga, Quesnelus sincerely admitted this, noting in the commentary on Letter 15 that the anathemas or chapters of this council were issued according to the pattern of the responses that our Leo once directed to Turribius. He observed such a close connection between them that he wrote, there's hardly a word that the Fathers haven't borrowed from Leo, and no chapters of Leo's that they haven't included. The earlier articles of the first 5 councils align with the 5 chapters of Leo, others match with others, though not in the same order or number, they completely agree. But who doesn't see that Quesnelum is undermining himself? He acknowledges that the Fathers of Braga crafted their chapters and anathemas from Leo's ideas and words. Moreover, the revered Fathers of Braga mention that they followed the chapters already published and written by the Fathers of Tarragona and Carthage in the Council of Spain. Therefore, the Fathers of both councils, adhering to the instructions and definitions of the Apostolic See, published and wrote the same chapters. Hence, there's no need to attribute that profession of faith with the accompanying chapters either to Augustine or to an uncertain author of Roman canons. However, both Quesnelus and Harduinus argue that this profession of faith isn't without flaw. They think it's now shown in an extended form compared to how it first appeared from its authors, since it mentions the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father and the Son, words that clearly suggest a later addition. I could certainly concede this, considering the disputes that arose later, due to the Photian schism, between the Roman Catholics and the Greeks in the 8th century and the ones that followed. But I don't agree with the criticisms of the 2 scholars, as both the readings of Leo's works and the age of the manuscripts from which we obtain the copies of this holy pontiff's works, prevent and prohibit me. As I investigate this doctrine in Leo's writings, various testimonies come to mind, which resolve questions raised later. Among these, I'm convinced that those written against the Priscillian heresy, which we're discussing, hold a principal place. When Turribius and the other bishops of Galicia and Spain explained the beliefs about the mystery of the Trinity, they clearly taught and defined that the Holy Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son. In the first chapter, it is shown how wrongly some think about the divine Trinity by claiming that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are one and the same person. They say that God is called Father at one time, Son at another, and Holy Spirit at another, denying the distinct roles of one who begets, one who is begotten, and one who proceeds from both. I believe no one can deny that this passage not only indicates but also expresses the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Son as well. Indeed, when it is stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from both, this procession must be equally from the Father and the Son. Certainly, Theodulf reasoned this way in his book on the Holy Spirit, using the word proceeds in the present tense instead of the past tense proceeded. Moreover, these words were noted by distinguished theologians who, to argue against the Greeks about the permanence of this doctrine in the Church, not only refer to the testimony of Leo but also to the profession of faith attributed to the popes of the First Council of Toledo. This doctrine of the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father and the Son was already well established in the Roman Church, as shown by two other testimonies of the Holy Pontiff expressed in sermons on Pentecost, which are worth mentioning here. We will discuss these further in the notes on those same sermons, which we will enhance with new insights in the following volume.
Chapter 16.
Does the profession of faith attributed to the Toledan popes reflect the style and era of Augustine? It's proven that the Code of Canons edited by Canel is wrongly attributed to the Roman Church. Even after removing the weak annotations by Canel and Ardouin, and disregarding the attributions of the praised profession of faith with its associated chapters or anathemas to anyone other than Leo and the bishops of Spain, we still need to discuss Augustine's writings. Among these, the monument we're discussing is claimed by Canel alone to have greater significance. He asserts that it is praised by the Master of Sentences in Book 3, Distinction 21, towards the end, with these words. According to this reasoning, he says, Augustine states, "If anyone says and believes the Son of God, God suffered, let him be anathema." The same Parisian editor notes that the place of Augustine is marked in the margin by what I believe is a more recent hand, Sermon on Faith, which is the third on Maundy Thursday. In truth, in Volume 10 of Augustine's works, there is a sermon numbered 129 concerning the time, titled On Right Faith, which the doctors of Louvain did not reject as an appendix, considering it to be an Augustinian work. This is as far as Canel goes, who, driven by zeal, presents various, but very light and contradictory conjectures, irrelevant to the purpose, as will be evident to readers, seeming to compete or play with nonsense and words. In explaining this matter, we would certainly need many words if we wished to note and then reject each thing he attempted to concoct there. But we think it's better to focus on certain specific topics, so we can clearly understand how far it departs from the truth. 2. To start, in the year 393, Augustine, while still a priest, spoke at the General Council of Africa in Hippo, held at the Basilica of Peace. During this event, he argued against the Manichaeans and discussed the divine persons without using any phrases similar to the words of the esteemed profession, nor did he address or refute any errors or sources of errors that the esteemed profession highlights. If we closely examine what was said about the Holy Spirit, those who value truth will see that the African Church's doctrine was quite different from the teachings of the Apostolic See at that time. Back then, this doctrine hadn't been thoroughly explored by learned and prominent scholars of divine matters. Thus, when they spoke of it as a gift of God, they did not claim it was born as the Son from the Father, nor produced from the Son as the Father's descendant, nor believed, like the Manichaeans did, that there are two first principles of all things. Regarding the Holy Spirit, Augustine noted that it hadn't been discussed thoroughly and carefully by the learned scholars of the divine scriptures to make its uniqueness clear. It is not referred to as the Son or the Father, but only as the Holy Spirit, unless it is proclaimed as a gift of God, affirming that God does not give a gift lesser than himself. They hold that the Holy Spirit is not born as the Son from the Father, for Christ is the only one, nor is it from the Son as the offspring of the Supreme Father, nor something owing nothing to anyone, but from the Father from whom all things originate. This avoids establishing two principles without a beginning, which is false and absurd, not part of the Catholic faith, but rather unique to certain heretics. Therefore, during Augustine's time, the question of the Holy Spirit's procession was very unclear among the Africans. The Fathers, educated in the sacred scriptures, referred to it only as God, gift, and love, not as the Son or the Father's descendant. However, they never preached that it proceeded from the Father and the Son as from a single principle. How can these ideas align with the doctrine of the Apostolic See, which is clearly expressed in a profession filled with much clearer and more appropriate language. If even in Africa, the phrases of the Apostolic See were in use, it would have been fitting for Augustine to use them in his discussion of the faith and the creed. Since he did not, and because the Holy Spirit had not yet been extensively and carefully discussed by learned interpreters of the divine scriptures, it is clear that the praised profession of faith cannot reflect Augustine's era, style, or doctrine. Strong arguments do not support Quesnel's opinion, whether from what Augustine responded to Orosius's consultation after becoming a bishop, or from what is found in other works, especially the book on heresies, written in 428. Augustine's works contain nothing to suggest that the profession of faith we are discussing is truly his creation. Regarding the book against the Priscillianists and Origenists addressed to Orosius, those who have examined this work would not find anything similar or consistent with his profession of faith within it. At the beginning, he admits he does not wish to address everything in Orosius's letter. As he says, "In some of my writings, which you have either read or can read, many things have been said that are effective against the heresy of the Priscillianists, although I did not intend to refute them, but while addressing other matters, I now understand that I have also dealt with this, when I hear from you what they believe." Therefore, Augustine did not aim to refute the Priscillianists before 415, as he only learned from Orosius that year what the people of that sect believed, having come from Spain. Yet he admits that when he was attacking the Manichaeans, he wrote many things that could apply to the Priscillianists, who were closely aligned with the Manichaeans in many doctrines. However, there's no evidence in his writings that he could have composed this profession of faith. At that time, neither he nor Orosius were aware of all the blasphemies or errors of the Priscillianists. It would have been like him rashly attempting to write a profession of faith against a heresy whose errors were not yet known to him. Indeed, I wouldn't dare to say this unless the writings of Orosius to Augustine and Augustine's book to Orosius provided such arguments. Since Orosius himself proposes to present only 3 questions concerning the Priscillianists, and the others he mentions don't align with the errors of Priscillian but rather pertain to the teachings of the Origenists, both testify that not all the comments of the Priscillianists were known to them. Regarding the questions that Orosius proposed for Augustine to explain, we reveal them right away. The first concerned the nature and substance of the soul, which the Priscillianists claimed was not entirely created but falsely contained a portion of the divine nature. The second question revolved around the formation of human and corporeal members, which they claimed were named after the patriarchs and that the signs of the heavens were arranged in them. They tried to confirm this outrageous superstition and impiety with a book titled Memory of the Apostles. Orosius also testified that this book is filled with other fables and fabrications. The final question was about the mystery of the Trinity, which they claimed consisted of a single word. They asserted a union without any existence or property, stating that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were this one Christ. Therefore, Augustine, addressing only these 3 errors, couldn't have composed and sent that profession of faith to Orosius or any bishop of Spain, in which, besides those 3 listed errors, 14 or 15 others are condemned and rejected, which had not yet come to Augustine's attention. Don't use Augustine's letter to Siricius against me. What does it actually prove? The main point the Holy Father makes is to expose the deceptions used to corrupt the Holy Scriptures with apocryphal texts, falsely claiming that Christ recited a hymn before his passion in the garden, preferring it over canonical books. However, I can't specify the year Augustine wrote this letter. As I read it carefully, I found nothing that supports Quesnelian theories. Moreover, no one should think that Augustine's work in the year 420, against the lies and perjuries of the Priscillianists, or regarding the books of Dictinius, supports such theories. In that work, he addresses the nature of falsehood, refutes opposing arguments drawn from misinterpreted scriptures, and asserts that Dictinius, as a penitent, died in peace with the Church, as we've already seen, but nowhere do we find even a single trace of that profession of faith. Before we discuss the text that Quesnellus claims as Augustine's genuine work, we need to talk about the book he wrote against all heresies in the year 428. We acknowledge that the Holy Bishop of Hippo, in section 70, addressed various errors of the Priscillianists in detail. But if we set aside the dissolution of marriages and bodily impurities that the Priscillianists indulged in, which he denounces, he adds nothing beyond what he already criticized in letters to Orosius and Consentius, and in the letter to Siricius. Therefore, not all the secrets of that sect were known to Augustine or others at that time. If they had been revealed 2 years before he passed away, he certainly would not have omitted describing them, as he aimed to record the errors of each heresy in this work, and he should not be blamed for this. During that period, the affairs in Spain and Galicia were deeply troubled. As a result, the sacred leaders of the churches, under the control of barbarian and Arian rulers following the Roman Empire's split, were unable to hold synods, address heretical and disobedient clergy, or exchange letters to resolve critical issues, seeking essential support from other bishops within the Catholic community. If our viewers sincerely consider these matters, which we've discussed extensively before, they'll understand that our intention wasn't to discredit Augustine or criticize him for ignorance, but rather to convey what aligns more closely with the truth. Referring to the consultations of the Spanish bishops Eutropius and Paul doesn't assist Quesnel. For example, they supposedly sent a memorandum to Augustine about the growing errors in Spain, suggesting this document might have been requested by the Spanish bishops and written by Augustine. But where does Quesnel get this idea? He claims it comes from Orosius's consultation or memorandum. However, Orosius's words present a challenge for Quesnel. The bishops, Eutropius and Paul, motivated solely by the benefit of everyone's salvation, had already provided a memorandum, according to Orosius, about some heresies, but they didn't mention all of them. Regarding which heresies these bishops consulted Augustine, Orosius remains completely silent. If they had consulted him about the Priscillian heresy and errors, or if Augustine had written that document and those anathemas at their request, why did Orosius feel the need to quickly publish and compile all the destructive elements into one comprehensive document? Wasn't that entire profession of faith, or document, already included in the 18 or 26 anathemas deemed necessary for the eradication of that heresy? Furthermore, if those two bishops had discussed the matter with Augustine, or if he had responded to them, Quesnelus either believes he satisfied them or not, but in either case, he contradicts himself. If we consider the first scenario, he must explain why Augustine, when consulted again by Orosius on the same issue, did not refer him back to the profession of faith and the anathemas he had written at the request of bishops Eutropius and Paul. He would have referred him, just as he directed him to read certain works published against the Manichaeans, saying, "You have read them, or you can read them." Why then does he admit that he understood from Orosius what the Priscillianists believed, and that their most absurd ideas had already been debunked in Spain? But I believe it has been clearly shown that Augustine was not approached by Eutropius and Paul about the errors of the Priscillianists, nor did he ever respond to those bishops on this issue. Nevertheless, even though I have written extensively about this book of faith, it seems pointless if it were attributed solely to Augustine by the judgment of the most distinguished men and the authority of manuscript copies. Wouldn't anyone consider me a frivolous talker if, after examining other works by Augustine, which do not align with that praised profession of faith, this one piece that Quesnelus focuses on remained? Shouldn't we trust the old code of Roman canons, the master of sentences, the ancient and recent copies, and the scholars of Louvain, from whom Quesnelus himself has drawn arguments for his conjectures? In a matter of such importance, I shouldn't have to exert any effort if I oppose the judgment of a Parisian scholar with what the Fathers of the Congregation of St. Maur have declared in the latest Parisian edition of the works of St. Augustine. They rejected the profession of faith, along with its anathemas, which was attributed to Sermon 233 on the Catholic faith, and included it in the appendix of the fourth class, deeming it unworthy of Augustine's name. Here, we present the type of censorship they applied to this sermon. It effectively refutes all of Quesnel's individual arguments, except the one they believe relates to the pseudo-code of the Roman canons. They mention that it is now placed in the appendix for the first time. In the Louvain edition, its authenticity is uncertain, but Verlin and Winding consider it spurious. Apart from the last 14 anathemas, which were added from the Catholic faith confession of Damasus to Paulinus of Antioch, it contains only a booklet of faith, which is listed in the Code of Canons of the Roman Church, chapter 40, as follows: Booklet of Augustine on the Catholic faith against all heresies, also found in the Acts of the Council of Toledo, of the year 400, with some variations in the anathemas. The Master of the Sentences cites it under Augustine's name in Book 3, Distinction 21, possibly from the same Roman Code of Canons. Indeed, we've observed that the manuscript in Lund does not include the booklet among Augustine's sermons and smaller works. Certainly, these expressions sound less like Augustine to us, such as number 1, this alone is the Trinity of the divine name, not an imaginary body or composed solely of form, and all exercises of the body, or, as the Roman Code says, destructions, he felt, and number 2, this world was not made, and all its instruments. Finally, the word paraclete is used everywhere for the Holy Spirit. Estius, in Book 3 of the Sentences, Distinction 21 Section 3, suspects it was produced by a writer inclined toward the Nestorians, whose error some statements might accommodate, especially the fifth anathema. Thus far, this is the position of the S. Morris Fathers Congregation in the edition of the Praise Sermon. As I go through and copy these things, which greatly contribute to our work, I'm filled with admiration for the immense silence the Morris Fathers have maintained regarding the trivialities of Quesnel, both here and elsewhere. These matters certainly should not have been hidden, since Quesnel himself wanted the same fathers to support his conjectures in the new edition of the works of St. Augustine, which they were working on. It's clear to any scholar that he indicated this with these words. After a long series of comments, he concludes the 8th chapter of his dissertation on the booklets. We are expecting more, and things worthy of a very learned man, about this booklet from the Reverend Father, Lord Francis Delfau, a Benedictine ascetic, in the edition of the works of St. Augustine that he is preparing with his colleagues from the Abbey of St. Germain. I don't dare assert now that those learned and diligent men failed to provide evidence of their learning and sincere minds, but I am particularly displeased that in the noted preface to Sermon 129, now 233, they seem to support Quesnel by asserting the Roman Church's code of canons, which they understood to be filled with borrowed, corrupted, and interpolated monuments. We don't believe they intended to support Quesnel in this matter, as he, always led by his biases, sought to undermine the authority of the Roman Church, especially by showing that it had gradually become a follower of the constitutions and decrees of other particular churches, borrowing from them one monument or decree at a time, and translating these for its own use. We believe it's wrong to suspect that men renowned for their piety and learning deliberately chose to follow such a method. However, by adding just a word or two in the same spot, the reader could have been alerted that the book, which Quesnel published under the name of the Roman Church, is attributed to an unknown author, and is of entirely doubtful credibility. People with a refined critical judgment, as well as a basic understanding of early church history and theology, should view it this way.
Chapter 17.
Concerning the synods of Astorga, Selanova, and Braga held in the kingdoms of Galicia by decree of the Apostolic See, or approved by its support. Let's now turn our attention to the other councils held in the kingdom of Galicia, either supported or commanded by the Holy Pontiff, setting aside the predictions and trivialities of Paschasius Quesnel. Due to the uncertainty in judgment from the lack or loss of ancient records, I prefer to rely on the statements and observations of others rather than introduce anything new into the discussion. This relates to the matter mentioned by Idatius in his chronicle. In the city of Astorga in Galicia, several Manichaeans, who had been in hiding for years, were revealed through episcopal actions initiated by Bishops Idatius and Turribius, who then reported them to Bishop Antoninus Emeritensis. I'm hesitant to fully trust Stephen Baluz, the collectors of councils, Quesnel, and other scholars who believe that Manichaeans in this context refers to and identifies Priscillianists. Idatius, the author of that chronicle, clearly understood the significant difference between Priscillianists and Manichaeans, as we've discussed in these dissertations. However, these earlier words further increase my doubt. Some Manichaeans hiding for several years. It has been demonstrated in our previous 2 books, which we wrote about the Manichaeans with Pope Leo I and from the Acts of the Roman Inquisition, that Manichaeans typically sought hiding places and darkness, unlike Priscillianists. But who could believe that the Priscillianists, known for their shameless behavior, feared the light, and preferred hidden places, especially at a time when civil and ecclesiastical matters in Galicia were in chaos? Furthermore, in those regions, since the influence of the Priscillianists had grown so much that many even from the clerical and priestly orders were found to be corrupt, how could they possibly remain hidden? This situation causes the mind to waver more and more because Idatius, in his chronicle, mentions a certain Pasentius from Rome. Among these heretics, Pasentius had fled Asturica as a Manichaean. Bishop Antonius of Emerita captured him and expelled him from the province of Lusitania. Now, if we consider what's written about Rome, in both the annals and ancient sacred records, we'll see that the Priscillianists were never hiding or residing there. However, it's well known that Manichaeans from Africa sought refuge in the city during Pope Siricius's time. They prepared hiding places and often held sacrilegious gatherings, attended by Roman men and women, who were considered chosen ones. Yet, by divine plan, they remained in the city until the 4th or 5th year of St. Leo the Great's pontificate, when they were exiled and sent beyond Italy's borders by church and public decrees. It's possible that Idatius intended to hint at this when mentioning Pasentius, the Roman Manichaean. He wrote that Bishop Antonius of Emerita captured him and expelled him from Lusitania. The fact that Pasentius faced exile more than once can be seen as his being exiled from the city, especially since he fled from Asturica rather than being exiled from it. The conjectures proposed gained significant strength from the timeline of the Asturian Council, dated 274, and from St. Leo the Great's letter to Turribius. That council convened in the year 446, and the Manichaeans were expelled from all parts of Italy the previous year, 445, as clearly shown by Valentinian's edict. It's likely they then moved to Hispania and Galacia, where non-Catholic rulers governed those kingdoms. In the year 447, he wrote his letter to Turribius, and St. Leo addressed each of the questions posed to him. Do they think the Holy Pope would have remained silent about the Council of Astorga if it had been convened because of the Priscillianists? Turribius consulted Leo not about the errors of the Manichaeans, but about the Priscillianists. Therefore, when the acts of the council, along with a synodal letter, were sent to the apostolic seat, St. Leo would have either approved or disapproved of the acts, or at least mentioned them. This is especially true since he praises St. Turribius both at the beginning and at the end of the letter, advising him to hold one general or several provincial synods to purge the stains of the Priscillianists and restrain their wickedness and audacity. Since he does not mention even a single word about the already convened Council of Astorga, who could reasonably believe he noticed this against the Priscillianists? Therefore, led by these strong reasons, my opinion leans towards the idea that the council praised by Idatius and convened in the year 446 targeted the Manichaeans. However, whether that synod addressed the offspring of the Manichaeans or the followers of Priscillian, it is clear that the precept of St. Leo cannot be linked to it, but to another one convened in the kingdom of Galicia after Turribius received the letter from the Holy Pope with resolutions for all the proposed questions. After receiving this letter from Turribius, and considering the significant obstacles that delayed the calling of a general synod, the bishops of the province of Galicia decided to convene a particular council. However, the exact city where these bishops gathered remains undetermined to this day. Severinus Benius is convinced that this meeting was held in the town of Chelain, near the city of Lugo, under the presidency of Balcanius, bishop of the Church of Braga and metropolitan of Galicia. The opinion is clearly supported by Lucretius's preface given at the First Council of Braga. However, the words of St. Leo don't align with this, as he assigns the responsibility and burden of gathering bishops to Idatius and Sponius, as if they were appointed with metropolitan authority. Our brothers Idatius and Sponius will oversee the gathering. If, according to the Holy Pontiff, the dignity and honor of metropolitans were granted to Idatius and Sponius, then why would the bishops of the 4 provinces of Spain send the rule of faith they composed to Balcanius of Braga instead of to them? Surely, unless we want to imagine a third metropolitan in the province of Galicia, it must be said that one of those 2 bishops had died by the time the synod in Braga, presided over by Balcanius, was convened. However, Canal reasons with plausible conjectures that Sponius presided over this see before Balcanius, not Idatius. But even if we accept this, there remains doubt about Idatius's see. Sigebert, in his chronicle, indeed makes him bishop of the city of Lemica, which would force us to admit, besides the metropolitan of Lucas and another of Braga, a third one, a Lemican. To this, Canal, noticing this possibility, wrote, "Therefore, Idatius seems to have been the metropolitan of Lucas, even though Sigebert makes him bishop of Lemica. But it seems he confuses 2 Idatius, one of whom was the author of the Chronicle in the time of Leo, the other being an accuser of Priscillian, who was indeed the bishop of Lemica." Offering the reason for this error, he claims it was because the later Idatius, in the preface to his Chronicle, asserts he was born in the city of Lemica, but if he had attained this bishopric, he would not have omitted to mention it there. However, Canal adds, he seems to indicate his metropolitan dignity when he says there that he was appointed to the highest office. At the end of the praised preface, he sorrowfully laments the disordered state of church order in the province of Galicia, as if he is especially connected to it, like the head of the province. He aims to respond to and aid the decline of divine discipline due to indiscriminate appointments. Based on these and other similar conjectures, which are shrouded in great darkness, Quesnellus persists in believing that 2 synods were held in the province of Galicia to eliminate the Priscillianists. He claims one was convened at Lugo and the other in the city of Braga. Whether the 2 provincial councils, convened by the order of Leo, ended successfully, ancient records do not reveal. Elsewhere, their acts have been lost due to time and damage. However, if we consider the Church's remaining records, it is believed the heresy was not completely eradicated and abolished in the kingdom of Galicia at the time. Although Turribius, Idatius, Sponius, Balcanius, and other bishops restrained it through synodal acts, ensuring that while they were alive and Leo the Great was still alive, the Priscillianists did not dare to boldly re-emerge, yet over the following years, it was discovered their errors resurfaced in those regions. Before we conclude, we will briefly cover in the next chapter what remains to be said about the Priscillian heresy.
Chapter 18.
The latest acts of the Church of Braga to eradicate some remaining vestiges of the Priscillianist error. Despite various efforts by Roman popes, other holy bishops, councils, and rulers of the time, the Priscillianist influence was still not completely eradicated by 500 AD, as ancient Christian records clearly show. The harmful beliefs and practices of this sect, which had corrupted the faith and religion of many in Spain and Galicia, could not be swiftly remedied by the sacred Catholic leaders. So, Even though the seeds of sacrilege and blasphemy seemed to be hidden for a time due to the bishop's efforts, they re-emerged, particularly in the Kingdom of Galicia during the 6th century of the Church. This was a great concern for Profuturus, the metropolitan bishop of the Church of Braga. After initially following the decrees of the Apostolic See and provincial synods, he consulted the Apostolic See again with his letters in the year 538, regarding new issues that we will soon discuss. Those in Galicia tainted by Priscillianist beliefs, under a guise of religious piety and Christian abstinence, avoided eating meat. Bishop Profuturus, knowing this was done not out of devotion but from a spirit of rejection, referred the issue to the Apostolic See. He asked if they should be punished with the same anathemas once applied to the Manichaeans, according to the decrees of the Holy Fathers for similar offenses. At that time, the Apostolic and Roman seat of St. Peter was led by Pope Vigilius, the 276th Pope. He quickly addressed Profuturus's consultations, first condemning the superstition of those who believe certain foods were tainted by contact with meat. He states that, of all the things God's mercy has provided for human sustenance, nothing is considered unclean by Catholics. To further instruct the Bishop of Braga and strengthen the authority of the apostolic decrees, he cites the Scriptures, which warn against such errors. For instance, Paul wrote to Titus, "To the pure, all things are pure." And in the first letter to Timothy, it says, "In the latter times, some shall depart from the faith." Finally, the Gospel according to Matthew states, "Not what goes into the mouth defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth, this defiles a person." Relying on these and other similar scriptural testimonies, the Fathers before Vigilius condemned those who abstained from eating meat and believed that things mixed with meat should also be avoided. However, as Vigilius wrote this, he wisely used language that would disarm envious individuals and recent sectarians. Therefore, he did not reject abstinence as a way to restrain the uncontrolled passions of our bodies, which the entire assembly of Holy Fathers affirms is most pleasing to God. For this reason, it's clear that the Church has reasonably prescribed the selection and distinction of foods during vigils and Lent, but he teaches that those who wickedly and superstitiously rejected the creations of the Lord should be excluded from the society of Catholics. Therefore, he says, while we do not reject abstinence pleasing to God, we also do not accept those who abhor the Lord's creation into our society. However, the Priscillianists, with their sacrilegious mindset, introduced a new error concerning the mystery of the Trinity. This happened even though the bishops of Toledo, Braga, and Lugo had already written and published statements of faith in their councils. These statements affirmed the unity of substance, nature, power, and authority in the three divine persons. To challenge this doctrine, the Priscillianists and other heretics altered the hymn of glorification, which the Catholic Church had long established to be sung at the end of the Psalms. They corrupted it by omitting a conjunction, saying, "Glory to the Father, and the Son, Holy Spirit." The Holy Pontiff points out that this is a new kind of error, noting that these heretics aim to teach that the Son and the Holy Spirit are just one person. To counter this error, Vigilius states that it suffices to remember that the Lord Jesus Christ instructed that baptism should be performed by believers in the invocation of the Trinity, saying, "Go, teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." This provides evidence that he intended for these three persons to be mentioned with equal distinction. Besides addressing the errors of the Priscillianists, there were other matters, such as the baptism of the Arians, the restoration and consecration of churches, and setting the date that year for celebrating Easter and Pentecost, which Profuturus proposed to the Roman Pontiff for discussion. Notably, there was consultation or question number 277, to which the Roman Pontiff responded fifth, prescribing that the ancient order of ecclesiastical discipline regarding the recitation of divine prayers in masses should be maintained. In this chapter, we come across various descriptions criticizing the inaccuracies in canonical prayers and the festivals of God's saints brought about by recent innovators and critics. I would gladly consider all of this if it didn't interrupt the narrative of the Priscillian heresy history. However, I felt it was necessary to highlight one thing. Bishops from distant parts of the world have relied heavily on the mandates and institutions of the Apostolic See. They not only referred matters of faith and bishops for definition but also matters related to festivals and the celebrations of the saints, seeking establishment and guidance with humility. Reflecting on this, I became convinced that the rule of canonical prayers originally came from the Apostolic See, at least in the West. No church or minister dared to deviate from this. This is strongly confirmed by the ancient fragment of a letter from St. Leo to Turribius, which we mentioned earlier and have decided to share publicly. Lastly, Pope Vigilius sent this order of canonical prayers, accepted from apostolic tradition, along with a letter to Bishop Profuturus, to clarify what should be followed during festivals. Therefore, he says, we have also sent the text of this canonical prayer below, which, by God's favor, we received from apostolic tradition. And so that your charity may know which parts are suitable to connect with certain festivals, we have similarly added the prayers for Easter Day. However, I find it unnecessary to elaborate on the reverence and submission of all churches and bishops to the apostolic see in these matters. Vigilius himself, without any ambiguity or deceit, following in the footsteps of his predecessors and the privileges of his own seat, clearly states that the Roman Church is the foundation and model of all churches, according to the consensus of all believers, because, he says, although the election of all apostles was equal, it was granted to the blessed Peter to have preeminence over all. After mentioning a few other points, he discusses the chief prerogatives of the Roman Church, asserting that it holds the primacy among all churches, so that both major matters concerning bishops and judgments, as well as significant questions of the churches, should always be referred to it as the head. Therefore, regarding the prerogative of primacy, the appeals made from the judgments of bishops to the apostolic seat, and the rights reserved for this apostolic seat in more significant cases, Pope Vigilius reviewed them both in the praised passage and throughout his letter. But since all these points are very well known to learned Catholic men, I choose to remain silent for now, intending instead to discuss the reasons why they might refute something in the letter as a fabrication. We must first consider the weakness of their objection based on the inscription of the letter. Specifically, that even in the oldest published copies, it bears the name Eucherius or Eleutherus. Cardinal de Aguirre did not deny this, teaching that this letter should be addressed to Profuturus, the Metropolitan Bishop of Braga in Galicia. But what does this objection amount to? For the error and negligence of the copyists cannot harm the well-established truth. Therefore, their scholarship should be considered less prudent and utterly futile, as they attempt to derive arguments of forgery and falsehood from the corrupted title and inscription of a document. Scribe errors were quite common and significant, especially when copying proper names of people and places, as seen in manuscripts from all times and languages. What matters to us now is that instead of Eucherius or Eleutherius, the name Profuturus should be read, as found in many respected manuscript codes, like the lists of the bishops of Braga and the tables of Roman consuls. These sources, along with the Acts of the Council of Braga held shortly after, clearly support this without any doubt. Several manuscripts, including the oldest one from Lyon and two older Colbert manuscripts marked with the best notes, from which the renowned Stephanus Belusius copied this letter, contain the name Profuturus. The initial acts of that council confirm he was the Bishop of Braga. Therefore, it's quite certain that he consulted the apostolic seat regarding both the Priscillianists and other issues during the time of Pope Vigilius, and that Pope Vigilius sent the letters we are discussing to him. As for the exact date, the eminent Aguirre states it's pointless to debate, since it is clear from the Colbert manuscript that it was written in the year when John was consul after Belisarius, which is the year 538. If there is still a debate about the final chapter of the letter suggesting forgery and falsehood, especially regarding the primacy of the Roman Church, I would emphasize the point, for I could not be swayed by the claim that it is missing in various Gallic manuscripts or that opponents say it is only found in the pseudo-Isidorian collection. Most importantly, this letter was addressed to the Metropolitan of Galatia. Therefore, we should place much greater trust in all the other ancient manuscripts of Spain, which were reviewed and compared by the esteemed Loisa, as well as those printed, where the chapter about the primacy of the Roman Church is found, rather than relying solely on the Colbertine manuscript. There is reasonable suspicion that the Colbertine manuscript might have been written in France during the times when bishops appealing to the apostolic see were being debated, especially toward the end of the 9th century under Pope Nicholas I, and later in the case of Gerbert of Reims, almost at the end of the 10th century. It's possible that those who opposed bishops Hincmar of Laon and Rothat of Soissons, who were appealing to the apostolic see, and who attempted to overturn the judgments of the bishops themselves, might have altered the letter of Vigilius by removing the chapter where they were condemned. This is what Cardinal Aguirre mentioned in the aforementioned context. These were the resources used by the latest editors of the councils in the notes to the letter of Vigilius, Volume 5, page 1290. It shouldn't be necessary for us to elaborate extensively on these two objections if we consider the authority of the Vatican manuscript examples. Indeed, in this apostolic library, there are several copies of this letter, showing the genuine name of Profuturus and the chapter about the primacy of the Roman Church, which convincingly prove that the letter hasn't been tampered with. But if such significant and numerous supports were not available to defend this beleaguered truth, could anyone still suspect the letter's falsehood and forgery? Away with such fiction. The truth is much more certain, backed by the support of the Braga Acts and the consensus of those fathers, to which Cardinal Aguirre, Balus, and the council collectors mainly adhered. It was essential not only to skim over these but to examine them more thoroughly and highlight them more clearly. As we've seen in the previous parts, in the year 563 AD, while Pope John III was leading the apostolic seat, and Ariomir, also known as Theodomir, from the Suevi lineage, was governing Galicia and Lusitania, the fathers gathered together. Long before their meeting, they had wished for a priestly council to be held to completely cleanse the contamination of the Priscillian heresy. So, they said, "Now then, since our most glorious and pious Son, inspired by the Lord, has granted us this desired day of gathering by royal decree, and as we are now assembled, let us first, if it pleases, inquire about the statutes of the Catholic faith." This meeting began on the 1st of May, as the following note makes clear. The Council of Braga was celebrated in the 3rd year of King Ariomir, on the 1st of May. We've already clearly stated in the previous parts from which statutes of the Catholic faith that council took its beginnings, criticizing Quesnellus, who tried to boldly claim the profession of faith described by the fathers of Tarragona, Carthage, Lusitania, and Baetica at the command of Pope Leo, with an uncertain author. Therefore, to avoid repeating what's already been said, we'll examine another part of that council where the praised fathers spoke extensively about Bishop Profuturus of the Church of Braga, as well as about the primacy and rights of the Roman pontiffs. For the institution of the entire clerical order, Lucretius ordered the preceding church canons to be recited, which general and provincial synods had drafted for the protection of ecclesiastical discipline and the honor of the sacred rites and church ministers. All the other bishops immediately agreed with this suggestion, considering it necessary and very useful to first refer to those institutions which were directed from the apostolic chair of St. Peter to a question once posed by his predecessor of venerable memory, Profuturus. The future bishop sat on the throne in Braga before Lucretius and received guidance from the apostolic chair of St. Peter to abolish the remaining superstitions of the Priscillianists, as acknowledged by the fathers of this council. Eager to comply, Lucretius promptly responded, "Your fraternity rightly remembered the authority of the seat." To all who were listening, he added, the authority of the apostolic seat was directed to a certain Profuturus, the bishop, and although its length prevents it from being included in these records, it was read. However, it can certainly be referred to the apostolic constitution of Vigilius. The 22 chapters outlined there are based on it, just as the previous canons and anathemas were derived from the letter of St. Leo to Turribius, which they praised. When drafting these new chapters, their primary aim was to abolish rites, ceremonies, and all profane practices and rules stemming from the Priscillianist depravity. Those impious and sacrilegious men not only corrupted Catholic doctrines but also distorted the order of divine offices and canonical hours. On more solemn days and during vigils, they recited peculiar readings while celebrating masses. They strayed from the apostolic tradition that prescribes the formula for greeting the people during sacred mysteries. They did not follow the same order and form in performing the sacrifice and administering baptism. They sang different psalms and other poetically composed scriptures, apart from those found in the New and Old Testaments, publicly in the church, and not all ministers of the clerical order refrained from eating meat. In chapter 14, they decided to address the suspicion of the Priscillian heresy. People must be compelled to taste cooked vegetables with meat. If they refuse, according to the decrees of the Holy Fathers of old regarding such individuals, they must be excommunicated and removed by all means due to the suspicion of heresy. These points are indeed very clear, and other similar matters could be presented to highlight the primacy and prerogatives of the Apostolic See, or to demonstrate the submission and obedience that bishops from distant parts of the world have shown, both in words and deeds, towards the Roman pontiffs. Regarding this obedience and sacred bond of unity with the Roman Church, the Spanish have always been proud, as the distinguished and learned D. Ildefonsus Clemente de Arostegui recently testified in this noble city for the Kingdom of Castile among the 12 jurists who judge cases of the Roman Forum. He composed an exhortation to the Spanish in Rome on August 21, 1747, aiming to encourage them to study literature for the honor and benefit of their homeland. Among other reminders to his fellow countrymen, he emphasizes this: from the earliest days of the Roman and Spanish Church, there has been a great union and partnership between the two. Hence, I was certain that in this city, the memory and principal monuments related to our history are preserved. And a little further he adds, here, I judged it would be easy to find the origins and dignity of each church. Here, their union, divisions, and transfer. Here, the acts of councils, the appeals of bishops, and the decrees of the holy pontiffs. As I listened to these words, I felt encouraged by the hope that neither I nor anyone else involved in Christian studies would find my current work, however modest, to be unappreciated. In these exercises, I have already discussed various topics that clearly show the close alliance, union, and fellowship with the Roman Church. Other topics provide strong arguments for understanding the ancient status, dignities, and privileges of those churches, as required by the order of things and the nature of writing itself. Finally, after completing my work on matters concerning the Priscillianists, their errors, and the councils convened against them, along with defending the rights and authority of the apostolic seat against the slanders of the envious, I will try to resolve just two minor difficulties in the following and final chapter. These have been drawn from the text and narratives of this council, which have sparked a great desire for debate in the minds of Paschasius Canel and others, as we will soon see.
Chapter 19 and the final chapter.
Paschasius Quesnellus mistakenly thought there were two individuals named Turribius during Leo's time. We now consider which specific year the Bracherance Council, which we've discussed, should be dated to. As Quesnellus reviewed the Bracherance records, he came to believe that, besides Turribius of Asturica, there was another man with the same name. This second Turribius was said to be a notary of the Apostolic See and delivered Leo's letters to the Galician Synod. Lucretius's words sparked this debate when he mentioned at the Bracherance Synod, "I believe your blessed fraternity knows that when the poisons of the most wicked Priscillian sect were spreading in these regions, the most blessed Pope of the city of Rome, Leo, nearly the 40th successor of the Apostle Peter, sent his writings against the wicked Priscillian heresy to the Galician Synod through Turribius, a notary of his see. If these words referred to Turribius of Asturica, they would be incorrect. As a bishop, he wouldn't be called a notary of the Apostolic See, nor would he be tasked with delivering letters to the Galician Synod." Baronius, anticipating this question, claimed there was only one Turribius. Ambrosius Morales, a notable writer on Spanish matters, initially disagreed. He argued that two Turribiuses should be distinguished, one who was the Bishop of Asturica, to whom Saint Leo the Great wrote, and another who delivered Leo's letters to the bishops of Spain, sent from Rome. Quesnellus supported this view and, somewhat assertively, criticized the renowned writer of the Annals. He tried to dismiss two arguments on this matter as trivial or containing glaring falsehoods. We simply don't have enough time to go over every detail of what Canel proposes in this controversy. Some of the points include: it wasn't always standard practice to write the names and letters of those who delivered them. For instance, Leo responded to Turribius through the same deacon, Provincius, from whom he received inquiries. Yet, to the Synod of Galicia, he should have sent someone from his own clergy, not an outsider, ideally another Turribius, not a bishop but a notary of the Roman See. These, and other similar matters, Canel gathers with too much effort and exaggerates to differentiate between the two Turribiuses. Moreover, when he felt challenged by the Leonine text from Baronius, he tried to twist it against him, claiming that the knowledgeable cardinal of the Roman Church and the author of the Ecclesiastical Annals had mixed up the role of a bishop, attending to church affairs with priestly care, and a deacon or notary acting on the bishop's orders, delivering letters like a messenger. This clever reasoning might amuse those who wish to flatter Canel by only scratching the surface, but what's more foolish or trivial than this? Is Canel suggesting that it's inappropriate for a bishop to bring letters from the Apostolic See to his province's synod with priestly care? Wouldn't he be fulfilling his church duties by carrying out such pontifical orders? But let our learned critic and annotator tell us if Leo's letters pertain to the African, Indian, and other Eastern affairs, or to the ecclesiastical matters of the Kingdom of Galicia, and even to Turribius's own diocese, which was being undermined by the Priscillian heresy. The issue is quite clear. Turribius, aiming to address the problems in his diocese and in Galicia, consulted Leo, seeking decrees and rules to eliminate the Priscillian heresy. Is it any wonder that the Holy Pope, accommodating all the requests of this bishop, instructed him to bring cases involving clerics corrupted by this plague to the provincial synod and tasked him with sending out circular letters to convene the Synod of Galicia? This approach was indeed more effective for curbing the Priscillianists and eradicating abuses that had infiltrated the ordinations of sacred ministers or those that had corrupted sacred rituals and church discipline. For Provincius, the deacon from Astorga who had come to Rome with Turribius's letters and was about to return home, could easily deliver not only the responses already given but also the letters addressed to other bishops of that province. This meant there was no need for the Supreme Pontiff, who was very aware of Turribius's zeal for faith and religion, to compel any other Roman cleric to undertake such a long and laborious journey. Leo's subsequent words make it clear he maintained this course of action. We have sent letters to our brothers and co-bishops in Tarraconensis, Carthaginensis, Lusitania, and Galicia, and we have announced a council of the General Synod to them. To what follows, I ask the followers of Quesnel to pay attention. It will be the responsibility of your diligence to ensure that the authority of our ordination is communicated to the bishops of the aforementioned provinces. Now, therefore, I ask Ambrosius Morales and Quesnel this: how could it be that it was the responsibility of Turribius of Astorga to ensure that Leo's ordinations or statutes reached all the priests of those provinces more safely unless they had been entrusted to the faith of Provincius, the deacon returning home with this letter of Turribius? Since I can't interpret Leo's words any other way, I'm inclined to believe that Turribius of Astorga was referred to as a notary of the Apostolic See by the Fathers of Braga because he was responsible for handling the written regulations of faith and papal authority. His main duty was to write back to St. Leo to ask if it would be feasible for all the priests from those 4 provinces to meet in a general council, or at least if the bishops of Galicia, led by Sponius and Idatius, could gather in a provincial assembly to tackle these important issues. Quesnellus points out that the term notary is never used in ecclesiastical documents in the way Baronius suggested, which was that it referred to someone who reports and informs the Roman See about events in the provinces. We can refer to the best Latin writers who use the term notary for those accustomed to recording church matters in public documents. So, why couldn't this role have been given to Turribius by the Apostolic See? What breach of episcopal rights would occur by performing this duty, especially when it was for the benefit of the Christian Republic and particularly of that province where the Roman pontiff had called for a council? Moreover, I'm still confused as to why we must recognize 3 completely separate letters of Leo, partly from Leo himself and partly from the dialogue of Lucretius of Braga, yet not consider them as having been sent simultaneously. This doesn't make sense. If we assume these different letters of Leo weren't sent at the same time, the Council of Galicia wouldn't have to be dated back to the year 447, as stated in Idatius' Chronicle, which all ecclesiastical writers agree with. Indeed, the first letter of Leo was written on the 1st of August of that year, which the Holy Pontiff, as we've often mentioned, handed over to the deacon Provincius as he returned to his homeland. So, we'd have to imagine that he had wings for Provincia to have reached Galicia in such a short time. Then, other messengers with letters traveled back to Rome, and others returned from Rome to Galicia. This ridiculous story, along with other pointless prophecies, was painstakingly argued by Quesnellus to slowly convince his readers about the 2 Turribios. Now, let's finally move past these and similar issues as we begin to investigate the true date of the Bracaran Synod. In this matter, it will be enough to briefly present the opinions of others and let the readers decide, rather than trying to settle the issue definitively. Severinus Binius, based on the esteemed Cardinal Baronius, believed that the Bracaran Council took place in 563 AD, a view also supported by Cardinal Aguirre, the compiler of the Councils of Spain. However, Garcias Loisa disagreed, claiming it happened 2 years earlier, in 561 AD, convinced that the fathers met at Braga under Theodomir, not Prince Ariomir. Theodomir was the king of the Suevi, whose significant conversion from Arian error and impiety was mainly discussed by St. Gregory of Tours, as all writers have noted. Nevertheless, Cardinal Baronius, with the agreement of Binius and the learned Petavius in the 3rd part of the Rationale of Times, has shown from reliable records that both names referred to the same king, with no errors in the manuscripts. Antonius Pagius, after considering both Baronius's and Garcias's views, refers to the Bollandists on March 20 in the life of St. Martin of Doom, asserting that Garcias correctly dated the Bracaran Council I to 561 AD. However, Pagius notes that this opinion is contradicted by Gregory of Tours, a contemporary of St. Martin of Doom. Various reasons drawn from the writings of Gregory of Tours suggest that the timing of that council should be reconsidered to the year 549 or the following year. However, he notes that since Gregory often makes errors when reporting events outside of Gaul, it seems best not to diverge from the Spanish writer Garcia. Finally, he observes that a letter from Pope Innocent III offers grounds to suggest that the council we are discussing was actually convened earlier, specifically in the year 560. But amidst such conflicting opinions, I hesitate to dismiss the views of Baronius and Cardinal Aguirre. All conjectures from opposing parties show no evidence, only signs of probability, and we find it unnecessary to dwell on them too much, lest we indulge in the very speculations we criticize in others. What we find most important to mention is that after the council in Braga was convened, there is no mention of the Priscillianist heresy and subsequent council acts or decrees of the Roman popes. Whether this was due to the piety of the sacred bishops and the power of the Catholic princes, who had begun to rule over the Spanish and Gallic people, leading to the eradication of those heretical movements, or whether they sought refuge under another name like the Manichaeans, Gnostics, or Montanists, I cannot say. It is not right to violate the best rules of criticism, as we believe those who rely too much on their own studies, without historical support, either obscure the truth with false appearances or create misleading images to deceive the unsuspecting minds of readers. Our other dissertations, as well as this one, will clearly show that we have always rejected this method.